Kingston upon Hull is a northern coastal town built on the industries of shipping and seafaring. It's a town epitomised by its friendly inhabitants and hard-working culture. But in 2003, a tragedy was to unfold here that would devastate a family and leave detectives shocked and sickened.
We felt that there was something sinister happening here and we had to deal with it at the highest level from the very beginning.
In the early hours of New Year's Day in 2003, one family's dreams for the future were transformed into nightmares.
I had a really bad feeling during the night when I was sitting on my own. I can never ever explain it, but I worried that the worst had happened.
Orchard Park, a quiet suburb of Kingston upon Hull and home to Ray and Wanda Moran and their two youngest children, John and Rachel. Close-knit and caring, the Morans only ever wanted the best for their children.
It struck me as very down-to-earth, honourable people.
21-year-old Rachel was the apple of her mother's eye.
She was the youngest in the family and we were older parents. I mean, I was getting towards 40 when she was born. And yet we allowed her to indulge us in a way because it made you feel that you were still young.
Rachel was a home bird, always keen to be close to her family.
Even when her best friend went to work abroad, she was horrified at the thoughts of joining her because she never wanted to go away.
And when Rachel moved in with her first serious boyfriend, Mark, she still visited her parents every day.
It was nice to know that when she finally did move out, she hadn't really moved that far. She was really only maybe 3/4 of a mile down the road.
Overall, Rachel was happy, and as 2002 drew to a close, she had big plans for the year ahead.
She wanted to be a chef. That was the thing she was most keen at, and she was going to go back to college in the new year and take up catering.
But Rachel's dreams of a new career would never be fulfilled. In the weeks leading up to the Christmas holidays, Rachel and Mark had acquired 2 kittens.
The kittens were like her children, and she was quite possessive and protective of them.
And as the holidays approached, Rachel and Mark formulated a plan to make sure the kittens were well looked after.
Cats are pretty independent and you could leave them in a room for a couple of hours and there wouldn't be any great hardship, but she felt as if they needed someone with them that night.
The couple decided that Rachel would stay in the flat with the kittens over Christmas, whilst Mark visited his mother. In return, Mark would then stay in on New Year's Eve so that Rachel could go out with her brother John.
I seem to remember Mark didn't have any money at the time, so he didn't particularly want to be out all night and was happy to look after the cats for New Year's Eve.
So as dusk fell on the evening of Tuesday the 31st of December 2002, Rachel joined her elder brother John in celebrating the new year at a local pub.
I was just delighted that she was going out with him. I wanted the two of them to do something together, and I thought a girl of 21 should be going out and enjoying herself.
Rachel had a good night. She'd enjoyed herself. She'd made some new friends. Midnight came and went, much like any other sort of New Year. They had the countdown, sang Auld Lang Syne, and we stayed in the pub perhaps for another hour after that.
It was only about 1:15 and I was still up reading when they both came home. John went upstairs immediately because he'd had a good few drinks and he was really jolly and happy, and he got himself ready for bed. I asked Rachel, was she going to ring Mark up and wish him a Happy New Year?
However, when Rachel called the flat, she was surprised that Mark didn't answer, and so she tried ringing his mobile telephone.
It was answered by a mutual friend of theirs, and Rachel could hear a party going on. As it happens, after Rachel had left on the afternoon to come here, these friends had phoned Mark and told him that they were having a party in the house. Asked would he like to come.
But Rachel wasn't happy.
I think she was upset and frustrated, mainly about the cats, but partly because she couldn't have a proper conversation because his mobile ran out of money. And there was no way she could speak to him after that.
Annoyed and concerned for the welfare of her kittens, Rachel made a decision.
I just thought she was getting ready for bed. And she came down, and when she got to the door, I heard her say, "Bye then, Mum." And so obviously I shot up and said, "Where are you going?" And she said she was going home.
Wanda followed her daughter out of the house.
It was really, really cold and windy and rainy, and I said to her, "You can't go home at this time. You don't normally walk home on your own." And she said, I have to go, because there's no one there and the kittens are alone.
Since it was New Year's Eve, taxis were scarce, and so Wanda pleaded with Rachel to stay.
And she sort of got a little bit exasperated with me, I think it was.
No matter what Wanda said to her daughter, Rachel had decided to take the mile-long walk back to her own flat.
I had just gone as far as I could with excuses and reasons, and there was nothing else I could say. And even as she was walking several yards ahead, I still shouted, "Ring me as soon as you get home," and she turned round and said, "Yeah." She said she would.
But Wanda would never hear from Rachel again. When Rachel Moran left her parents' house in the early hours of Wednesday, the 1st of January 2003, her mother Wanda had no idea that she would never see her youngest daughter again. Rachel had promised to telephone her mother on arrival at her flat, but when Wanda heard nothing after half an hour, she became concerned.
I tried her mobile and it just kept ringing and ringing and ringing, cut out. So I tried ringing her house and there was no reply. And then I tried again about 10 minutes later, and I tried quite a lot of times then. The only thing I did think was she might have decided to go out walking and looking for Mark. In which case, I did know then that she wouldn't answer the phone because she'd expect me to say, "Why aren't you at home?"
But after almost 2 hours of calling, Wanda decided that she had no choice but to go to bed.
I just saw no point in staying up, and I knew that I had to go to bed at some stage.
The next morning, Wanda woke up hoping for news of her daughter.
The phone woke me up and I ran downstairs thinking it was Rachel, and I was totally relieved. And instead it was our other daughter, Vanda, just ringing to say Happy New Year.
And Wanda was now faced with having to explain to her husband Ray and their son John what had happened the previous evening.
She told me very shortly after I got up that Rachel had gone home the night before, and that she had tried to call her to make sure she got home all right, and she couldn't get through to her. At that point, I tried to call her house phone and her mobile phone and couldn't get through to either.
The family were worried.
By that morning, her mobile just said, "We are unable to connect you."
But then the family received a sign of hope.
And John said there's someone there because the landline is engaged. So I tried about 5 minutes later and Mark answered the phone. And I just, oh God, I was so relieved. And I said, "Oh, Mark, is Rachel there?" And he said immediately, "Well, no, she's not here. She was staying with you last night, wasn't she?"
Mark went on to explain how he had been at the party all night and, after returning home about 7 a.m, he had gone straight to bed.
As far as he was concerned, he was the last person to leave the flat the night before, and it was exactly as he'd left it.
The cats hadn't been fed, there was no food for them, they were hungry, so she's not been here.
There was no sign that she'd been there to get changed, and she hadn't slept there.
And so, of course, I just was totally horrified then.
Wanda and John went straight over to the flat and saw for themselves that there was no sign of Rachel.
I had no idea what must have happened. But of course my mind was imagining all kinds of scenarios.
Wanda feared the worst.
I said, "I'm going to go to the police." It was only lunchtime, she hadn't even been gone 12 hours. And Mark was quite bemused, he thought. He said she could be anywhere, she knows lots and lots of people. But I was just worried because it was just totally out of character.
Wanda and John headed straight over to the Priory police station to report Rachel missing.
What we tend to do is look at the background circumstances to see whether there are any particular risks to that person and how vulnerable they might be. And we had a discussion, and it was very clear that Rachel was not the usual type of missing person that we get.
This was completely out of character. For her not to get in touch with somebody, not to say where she was, and for her to disappear like this, it was clear that something was very seriously wrong.
Realising there was a genuine concern for her safety, the police moved swiftly.
You cannot assume anything. So what you have to do is look at, well, what could have happened to Rachel? And there are scenarios, obvious ones. She could have had somebody else in another part of the country and was looking for a second life somewhere. She could be murdered. She could be lying in a ditch somewhere, having had an accident. The complexities of what you're dealing with are immense, really.
The detectives from Humberside Police launched a full-scale missing persons inquiry, and over 40 officers were assigned to the investigation.
When you start looking at a missing person case, you look at the people she's closest to, and on this case she was with her brother on the night time, and she'd gone back to her parents' address, so it was a brother, a mother, a father and a boyfriend, and you look for where she could be, where she's likely to be.
Detective Superintendent Davison also asked the family to give witness statements to help them understand more about Rachel.
And I said, your father will kill me if he knows I've let you walk home on your own.
We're looking for just a fine detail, just to get an idea of where she possibly may be, or find a link that can progress the investigation on.
And I said, I can't even put you in the car because I've had a couple of drinks. She said, it doesn't matter because I'm all right.
But there was nothing apart from a disagreement with a boyfriend on the night time.
Otherwise, the only other point of interest to the police was that Wanda mentioned a passerby that might be a possible witness.
It was either fair or his head was shaved. And he was wearing a shirt in a similar colour to the blue one you're wearing today. And I must have been really, really worried because I immediately thought of shouting, "Are you walking up this road? Will you walk with her?" Something made me think how stupid that is. It could be anyone.
While detectives tried to trace the passerby, officers also interviewed Rachel's boyfriend, Mark.
She spends the money on clothes. My mum always buys the clothes as well. So I was coming on with new tops and stuff.
We went through the finances, we went through their history together and built up as full a picture as we could of exactly what they were like as a couple. We knew that they'd had an argument, and we needed to make sure that we found out exactly if he had any involvement in Rachel's disappearance.
But the detectives were concerned by Mark's behaviour.
So I don't remember her talking to her either.
You don't remember talking to her at all? It's not an exact science. It's looking at a video of somebody to see whether they're hiding something, but he didn't seem at all worried or upset, which is in complete contrast to Wanda, Ray and John. Bearing in mind, they'd lived together for a long time and apparently in love and all the rest of it, so it just didn't seem right.
She won't have none of it, so I ended up going to my friend's house and there, because she didn't want to come. I got a bit upset with her.
Not only did Mark's behaviour seem unusual, but the circumstantial evidence was also stacked against him.
Statistics show that the vast majority of people who are murdered do know the murderer, and the general feeling was that he could be involved.
They'd had an argument that evening, and that's the reason why Rachel stormed off, very much against the mother's will. And I guess to Wanda, this was caused by the fact that Mark didn't do what he was supposed to do. If you look at it from that perspective, they wanted to know, had Mark something to do with Rachel's disappearance?
With a potential suspect identified, Detective Superintendent Davison instructed his team to re-examine Mark's alibi whilst a surveillance team monitored his movements.
What you're looking for is unusual behaviour, associations with people who may have been criminals, and building up this kind of movements to see whether there's anything suspicious.
But Mark went about his business as usual.
I've got to say that he did nothing out of the ordinary, no unusual behaviour, just went to his daily life, went to see his mother, so there's nothing at all which caused me concern.
And as the detectives verified Mark's alibi for the night of Rachel's disappearance, they began to realise it was unlikely that he was involved.
Mark was at a party till it was about 6 a.m. On Bransholme in Hull. There was lots of people at the party. We saw all the people that were there, and his account checked out. And there was nothing that made us believe that he was responsible for the disappearance of Rachel.
With his alibi proven to be true, the detectives were convinced that Mark was completely innocent of any involvement in Rachel's disappearance. But the elimination of Mark as a suspect left the detectives in a difficult position.
Once we'd discounted Mark, there was just absolutely nothing at all that we had any serious leads on. So literally, we just had no idea what happened to Rachel.
None of Rachel's clothes were missing, and records showed that neither her mobile telephone nor bank account had been used since her disappearance. So the possibility that Rachel had run away was discounted.
I wish the final conclusion could have been, yes, she's run away and she doesn't want to see any of us again. Because then, okay, well, we know what's happened, we know she's all right, but unfortunately we're not going to see her again. That would have been all right, but just not knowing what had happened would have been intolerable, really.
With no major lead to investigate, the detectives continued to explore every avenue in the search for even the smallest of clues.
It was decided to gather all the CCTV within a 6-mile radius, and that included all council CCTV, any shop CCTV, and any CCTV that people had in their own homes. So we had to gather that quickly. That was one of the urgent things we had to do.
And the detectives soon made a discovery.
We managed to recover some CCTV footage of Rachel passing a place called Jackson's, which is actually on Hull Road, which gave us the time when she would have been there and which direction she was travelling in.
Not only did the CCTV footage corroborate Wanda's account of Rachel's movements, but it also provided the detectives with a more specific location from which they could start a search.
And the search, I have to say, was massive on a scale that I've not done before. Pretty much the whole of the resources available, which would be the helicopter, dogs, horses, underwater search, we utilised pretty much non-stop from the beginning. And again, it was going outwards from our last sighting, really, which was the closed-circuit television image of Rachel.
But for Rachel's family, the searches only served to reinforce the seriousness of their daughter's situation.
When the police divers were dragging the rivers and cameras were there, I made a conscious effort never to watch the television, but Ray always did, and he got himself really upset. But I was detached from it. I just didn't want to think about it at all.
The painstaking search continued, and on Saturday, the 11th of January, the Humberside Police diving team began searching the Barmston Drain, a local canal full of household rubbish.
We went over this area several times, basically skimming the top of the surface, removing items, going over it again, digging a little bit deeper so not to disturb too much.
Amazingly, within hours of arriving at the canal, the divers recovered a vital piece of evidence.
A shoe was found which was of a similar make and style to what it was reported Rachel had been wearing, which was obviously of interest to the inquiry.
However, the next day, the diving team was stunned when they found a lady's handbag hidden in a discarded bin bag.
The bag was fetched out of the water, brought onto the bank, and very carefully, wearing protective gloves that had been opened up, and had a look inside it.
Amongst other items found inside the handbag was a mobile telephone, together with various cosmetics and hair clips. But there was one particular item that confirmed that the bag definitely belonged to Rachel.
Enclosed within the bag was a passport, which had obviously got photograph, signature and details, which referred directly to Rachel. Some other items you could turn around and say, well, it's possible it was, possible it wasn't Rachel's. A passport basically clinches it.
It looked to us that this had been dumped by somebody. It was in a bin liner. I think it was meant not to be found. So it was the first positive lead we'd got about the disappearance of Rachel. What I then expected to happen would be to find Rachel's body in the drain.
In the early hours of Wednesday, the 1st of January 2003, 21-year-old Rachel Moran left her parents' house on the outskirts of Hull to walk the 1 mile distance back to her flat. But Rachel never reached her destination, and a massive search conducted by Humberside police failed to reveal any new information until divers found her handbag in a nearby canal.
The possessions were wrapped in a black bin bag, and it told us that somebody had deliberately got rid of the property that Rachel had on her at the time, and it did give a far more sinister feel to the investigation.
When the family were told of the discovery, Rachel's mother Wanda couldn't help but speculate on what might have happened.
I didn't think for a second that anyone had thrown her in the water, but I just thought she must have been so distressed that night and overwrought that she'd gone to the drain and fallen in it. Not necessarily thrown herself in, but slipped in the dark, and I just felt totally guilty that maybe I could have done something to stop her doing that, you know, forced her back in the house.
And at that point, we thought that Rachel was probably dead. The next question is, though, where was she? And that was the difficulty, really. We hadn't found Rachel in the drain. We'd searched open land, burial sites, and again, it didn't really move as much further on into finding out what happened to Rachel.
While detectives attempted to trace a passerby who may have seen Rachel leaving her mother's house on the night she disappeared, Detective Superintendent Davison staged a reconstruction to refresh the memories of any potential witnesses.
We did have a police officer who had a resemblance to Rachel. She was wearing the same clothing, walking along the same route, to try and get someone to jog the memory, to see if they'd seen anything or if they'd seen Rachel on that night.
And a number of new witnesses came forward following the appeal.
We did get an excellent response, but it was New Year's Eve into New Year's Day, and some people had had a drink. The recollection wasn't as accurate on some occasions as it could have been.
However, the appeal also led to the recovery of a second batch of CCTV footage from a nearby school.
It was one Friday afternoon where a detective going through footage from CCTV asked me to come and look at an image on the screen. And he showed me this image on the screen, which was very difficult to see and understand what you're looking at. And he said, well, I think it's a female, and you could see light, which would be the head, then dark, then light. And he said, that's the head, that's the dress, and that's the legs. And I said, do you think that's Rachel? And he said, yes.
If the image on the screen was Rachel, she would have been only 150 metres from the front door of her flat.
That raised my hopes that could have been Rachel at that time, which meant significantly that she got to a certain point on Hall Road and may have gone a slightly different route home. The route that we anticipated she would have taken was brightly lit. However, the route she took led her into darkness, and from a female's perspective, put her in a much more vulnerable position.
This new find immediately provided the officers with a major new lead to investigate, and when they ran the tape on, the detectives made a startling discovery.
Following Rachel, there appeared to be another figure. Very difficult to tell, again, whether it's male or female. But the gap between the two wasn't very great. If Rachel had been murdered, that was possible a person that could have been involved.
As he considered his options, Detective Superintendent Davison realised that Rachel's disappearance could be at the hands of a stranger.
The likelihood is that, she's got to that point and disappeared. It could be a stranger abduction. And there aren't many in this country in any 1 year, very few, 2 or 3.
If Rachel's abductor was a random stranger, then the Humberside detective team faced a major new challenge.
If you're going to capture a stranger, a true stranger who's killed Rachel, then they are going to do everything possible, to evade detection.
The discovery of the new CCTV footage reinvigorated the investigation and gave the senior investigating officer an ambitious new idea.
But if a person is abducted on foot, 98% of the bodies are found within a half-mile radius of the last sighting, and 99% are found within a mile of the last sighting.
Based on that information, I made a decision to search all of those houses within a 1.5 mile radius, which means basically knocking on somebody's house and asking to come and search the house from top to bottom, including fridge, freezers, lofts, everything.
The operation would require over 100 officers to search every house in the vicinity and relied on the goodwill and cooperation of the Orchard Park residents.
The best I'd hoped for when I made that decision was that if she was in a garage or a car or a house, by going high profile in the media that I'm going to do this, that we would have Rachel's body dumped somewhere.
But if the operation failed, Detective Superintendent Davison would have wasted thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money.
It was a difficult concept for people to get their head around, particularly the officers who worked for me, and it was a decision which most people didn't agree with, because this would commit hundreds of officers every day to searching by consent.
Despite the concerns of a number of officers, the plan was put into action on Tuesday, the 28th of January.
We assembled, I think, 100 officers, and I did the briefing, explained what I was going to do. And I've got to say that most people looked at me and thought, it's time they carted this guy off, really, because he's balmy.
In order to raise awareness of the operation and to assist in explaining the officers' objectives, Detective Superintendent Davison invited the television news cameras to observe the initial searches.
It was pouring down with rain, freezing cold. We knocked on the first door and a little old lady came. Then we asked to come in, and with her cameras rolling, she swore at us and slammed the door. And at that point my heart sank, because looking at what was happening in other streets, people were not answering the doors. And I thought, what have I done? This is the worst decision I've ever made in my life, really.
Each team was made up of 2 police officers and a search specialist, and by lunchtime they had already inspected dozens of houses. But then Detective Superintendent Davison received an unexpected telephone call.
One of the incident room staff said, "You got a phone call." And he'd said it was a detective who was upset.
Believing that the officer had possibly had a run-in with an angry resident, Detective Superintendent Davison braced himself.
And so when I picked up the phone, it was just expecting that call, that it was a detective saying, "I'm not going to do this."
But instead, one of his officers had some vital information. PC Steve Dennison and his colleagues had been searching property close to Rachel's flat when they knocked on the door of number 19, Nash Court, the home of Michael Little.
Inside the address there was Mr. Little and a friend of his, and they knew what was going on in terms of what our presence was there as part of the high-profile, publicised searching of addresses. It appeared to me that it was a flat for one person, and his friend was merely visiting. Michael Little was willing to direct us around his house, to show us which was the living room, which was his bedroom.
The search didn't take long, and the officers were soon ready to leave.
Each flat has its own locked bin cupboard where they would maybe put the dustbin or a wheelie bin, and that was the last thing that we had to search before we left.
And so the police officers asked Michael for the keys to the cupboard.
At first he told us that he didn't have the key, or didn't know where the key was, but we pressed the point because we wanted to make sure that we did search that cupboard before we left to move on to the next address. And he suggested that the key might possibly be at his mother's house.
The police officers were puzzled.
It did seem a little strange that a guy wouldn't have the key to his own bin cupboard. So again, we pressed upon him further, asking him where the key was. Suddenly he was able to locate the key and unlock the door, and then he returned back into the flat. Inside the cupboard was a pile of rubbish, boxes, carpet, bin bags full of what I would presume is household waste.
The 2 men started to search the cupboard.
So I'd picked up an item of rubbish off the pile and I just placed it on the floor next to me. As I was doing that, another officer had reached in to pick up the next piece of rubbish, and I'd noticed that he wasn't moving, and I looked across and he was looking into the cupboard, and I looked at where he was looking, and that's when I saw a leg sticking up from the pile of rubbish.
And at the back of the tiny cupboard, the detectives found the body of Rachel Moran.
It was a shock. It was such a small space, and really I wouldn't have expected to have found a person or a body inside a space of that small size.
Realising that the 2 men sat in the flat could be involved, the police officers returned and immediately arrested them on suspicion of murder.
They both responded in a completely different way. Little's friend said something to the effect of, "Murder, what have you found in the cupboard?" Michael Little looked up and said words to the effect of, "He knows nothing about it." I got the impression that that was a genuine response, that clearly the friend was as shocked as we were, and Little knew what was there, and he'd resigned himself to the fact that his fate had caught up with him.
The officers reported their findings to the investigation team and waited patiently for assistance.
We waited for transportation to come and take ourselves and the prisoners away from the scene, and the first vehicle arrived and my colleagues took away Little's friend.
As PC Dennison and his prisoner waited alone in the small flat, Michael Little started to talk.
He was in a position, I presume, where he felt he needed to get it off his chest as to what had happened. He'd bottled it up for a month, and now he'd been caught. He clearly wanted to disclose information to me.
PC Dennison reminded Little of his rights before recording the confession in his notebook.
These are quotes. "I'm so glad you found her. I've wanted to tell someone for ages. It's such a weight off my chest. I saw all the police stuff on the news and just hoped they came here. I've not told anybody else. Nobody knows." He said, "I can't be a normal person doing this. I must be evil or something. I saw her that night walking alone, so I went over and spoke to her. She came back here for a drink and we chatted for a while, but ended up arguing. I think I walked out of the room or something, and when I came back, she'd gone to the kitchen and was stood at the side with her back to me. When I went near her, she turned around and I saw a small knife in her hand. She slashed out at me and cut me on my arm."
PC Dennison was stunned.
It's a difficult situation, so all you can do is try and be as professional as you can and record it as closely as you can.
And the news that Rachel's body had been discovered spread quickly.
I personally felt relieved. I didn't even think of the horror of it and anything else. I just thought, thank God they found her. And we can get her back. We can have her home, and she's not going to be somewhere forever and never found. And I would have found that really hard to live with. Ray said he would have preferred that. If he thought, if he could keep thinking in his heart of hearts, well, she could be alive.
In my own mind, I was hoping that nothing particular had happened that had been particularly bad. But that was the end of my hopes. And I just remember going into a back room and just standing looking out the window. And my dad came through, and I just remember my dad and me just hugging each other.
It was a mixture of tremendous sadness for the family, but professional elation, I guess, in terms of we've found Rachel, which is the aim of the searches. We have 2 in custody for murder, so you've actually got the killers probably in the scene of where it happened, which was far, far more than I could ever have hoped for when I intended to begin the searches.
But everyone was left asking one question. Who is Michael Little? Four weeks after disappearing as she walked home from her parents' house, Rachel Moran's body was found in a storage cupboard in an apartment block near her home. As police officers descended on the scene, the key holder immediately confessed to killing Rachel in self-defense during an argument. And when the senior investigating officer arrived, even he was shocked by what he found.
The flat was best I could describe as squalid, really.
The detective looked in the storage cupboard.
Rachel was at the bottom of the cupboard and wrapped in a duvet, in a fetal position. A really upsetting scene, really. I actually touched Rachel's leg because she didn't look real. She looked like a mannequin, really.
Whilst the pathologist and the forensic teams worked to retrieve both Rachel's body and any significant evidence, PC Dennison arrived at Queen's Gardens Police Station with his prisoner Michael Little.
I asked him if he could read through the specific phrases and admissions that he told me whilst we were together at the flat.
Other than one or two minor points, Little agreed that the notes were accurate and signed them to authenticate his account.
What's rare in these cases is not so much that someone admits to an offence, but when it's put on paper and presented to that person, that they stand by their admission.
The investigation immediately focused on learning more about their suspects, with the detectives paying particular attention to Michael Little.
He was a man in his early 20s. He was grossly overweight. He did suffer from some depression, which he was receiving some medication for. He seems to have accepted his life as unemployed and on benefits, and he used to spend a lot of his time in his flat, either watching pornography, smoking cannabis, or drinking.
And his friends revealed that Little openly fantasised about having relationships with women.
They talked about Little speaking about a girlfriend that he'd had, but none of them believed him, because none of them thought that he'd ever had a girlfriend because of his inability to speak to women when they were out together.
But it was the description of Little's mystery girlfriend that concerned the police. She was supposedly slim, blonde, and over 6 feet tall, just like Rachel.
He used to spend a vast amount of time in his flat, just looking out the window, just looking at people going past. And with Rachel living so close by, we believe that he'd been looking out of his window, he'd seen Rachel going about a normal daily business, and he'd maybe been looking at her and fantasising about her.
The detectives investigating Rachel's murder also started to verify Michael Little's alibi for the early hours of New Year's Day.
He went out hoping for a good evening, met up with some friends, but got a knock back from a girl he fancied, and one of his friends went off with that female, and so he would have felt upset at that, I think.
Little then bumped into another friend who invited him to a party which he stayed at until just after midnight.
We believe that he then decided to walk home, still feeling the aggression at being knocked back.
And when detectives traced the route Little used to walk home, they realised he was the passerby they'd been trying to find.
Coincidentally and tragically, he walked past Mrs. Moran and Rachel as they were talking outside Mrs. Moran's home address.
He may well have heard Rachel say, "I'm going to walk home because my boyfriend's gone out and left the kittens." And Michael Little may have formed the opinion that that would have been his chance to follow Rachel along Hall Road.
We'd gone back to the CCTV, and it was clear that the person that was 3 minutes in front of Rachel walking down Hall Road was indeed Michael Little.
But the figure seen in the second CCTV clip ran up behind Rachel, a fact which in itself revealed a disturbing truth.
Based on that sequence where we've got him ahead of Rachel and then a switch round, Rachel ahead of him later on, that again suggests to me that he was kind of waiting, hanging around, and this was some degree of premeditation to what he subsequently did.
Although no murder weapon was found, the post-mortem immediately revealed how Rachel had been killed.
The cause of death was severe and multiple stab wounds to the back, and one or two were so forceful they'd come through to the front of Rachel.
Rachel had been stabbed from behind 27 times, and the pathologist also noted that there were no signs of any defensive wounds.
It tended to suggest to us that there'd been no struggle and that he'd stabbed her from behind, and she had absolutely no knowledge of it, really.
The discovery of dried mud on the back of Rachel's legs helped detectives piece together what had happened the night she died.
Well, it suggested to me that she'd been dragged across the grass against her will. Maybe he had his hand over her mouth so she wouldn't be screaming, and then dragged Rachel into the flat where he lived.
Forensic analysis confirmed that Rachel had been in Little's flat.
There was blood from Rachel inside the flat, not just in the cupboard on the landing. And based on the amount of blood and the distribution, that she was killed in the hallway.
Although Little claimed to have acted in self-defence, there was no forensic evidence to substantiate his story.
He said Rachel had attacked him with a small knife and cut him on the arm, but there was never any injury. He was examined and there wasn't a cut to his arm.
These revelations allowed the detectives to piece together their own theory of how events unfolded during Rachel's final moments.
Based on what we know of Michael Little, he maybe couldn't believe his luck that he came across Rachel walking home in a very vulnerable state, and possibly tried to befriend her, knowing Rachel, as we kind of do now, her background, she would have had none of it.
The detectives believe this second rejection of the evening pushed Little to breaking point.
Michael Little, I think, abducted Rachel, dragged her into the flat and killed her, and then put her into the cupboard, wrapped in a duvet. At some point, though, he got rid of Rachel's or some of Rachel's belongings and dumped them in the river, which we subsequently found.
The combination of Little's confession and the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming.
It was the worst kind of coincidence you can think of, really, and Michael Little was probably the last person, the most dangerous person Rachel would have come across that evening. If she'd come to the gate with a mother a minute later, then Michael Little would have been in front of her. A minute here, a minute there, it wouldn't have happened.
Convinced of his guilt, detectives charged Michael Little with the murder of Rachel Moran on Friday the 31st of January 2003. Meanwhile, detectives found no evidence to connect Michael Little's friend to Rachel's murder, and he was released from police custody unconditionally. Rachel's funeral took place 4 weeks later, and the Moran family continued to mourn her tragic death. However, a new revelation would torment the family further. Swabs taken during the post-mortem revealed that Little had had sexual intercourse with Rachel.
The decision I had to take is whether to arrest Michael Little for rape of Rachel, even though he was already charged with murder. But I decided not to, based on the fact that I really didn't know whether Rachel was alive or dead when he had intercourse with her.
I was totally convinced that's what he'd been aiming for to start with, and that she'd probably spurned his advances, and that's when he'd totally lost it. But that's no consolation, is it?
The trial of Michael Little took place over 3 weeks, and on the 30th of October 2003, he was found guilty of murdering Rachel Moran. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and ordered to serve a minimum of 25 years. But the trial failed to reveal exactly how or why Michael Little was driven to murder Rachel Moran, and so her family are left with questions that will never be answered.
So all she wanted to do was get back to feed her kittens, and purely by chance this monster she came upon, Michael Little, took her life away in the most brutal circumstances.
You know, Rachel did have everything to look forward to, and he had done nothing with his life. He'd done absolutely nothing, and the only thing he's done is destructively take away Rachel Moran.
I remember playing with her as a little girl in the garden, going to school, and then later on we had a few nights where we'd gone out together, and then I remember last night as clear as day. But then I can't reconcile that with what happened just a couple of hours later. It's almost something I don't want to believe, because my sister's not here anymore.
You would hate to think it was somebody who knew her or she was close to, or cared about her and she cared about them. So in a way, there is some kind of comfort in knowing it was a stranger, but at the same time, it does absolutely infuriate you to think that someone thought they had the right to do that to someone who they didn't even know, and it didn't matter. You know, it didn't matter to that person that she was somebody's kid, you know, and somebody's sister, and it just didn't give a second thought that night.
This is a story of darkness and greed. Of what happens when nothing gets in the way of the pursuit of money, not even love.
Devastating. Devastating. It was your worst nightmare.
On a modest and tranquil estate on the northern fringes of London, a couple are bringing up 2 young children. But forces are at work which will shatter their world and their chance of future happiness. Right from the start, Sharon from Barnet in Hertfordshire stood out as a star. Aged 14, she was learning karate and heading for the top of the class. Little did she know it was to change her life. She caught the eye of the trainer, Gary, a 5th Dan black belt and secretary of the Karate Club of Great Britain.
Sharon didn't really go in for anything unless she thought she could be the best.
Also in the karate class, Sharon's best friend from school, Paula.
Paula was always in Sharon's life, really, from very tiny right the way through. They'd been through same schools.
Gary started his working life as a jeweller and was separated from his wife. And though Sharon was only half his age, Gary began a relationship with her. He invited her on a karate trip to Canada. Then her parents learned the only person Gary was taking was Sharon.
And what do? Sharon was coming up for 16. Do you turn around and try and put a block on them and say, no, you're not going to do this, you're not going to do that? And maybe them turn around and say, well, on your bike, I'm going, and breaking the family up completely.
There was something not right. I was at a loss to see the attraction of somebody with such a huge age gap.
You have to bite your tongue and say, yes, but not, if you're going to do it, you're going to have to fund yourself and make them sort of realise that they've got to pay for it. But it was very, very hard, very, very difficult.
But Sharon was flying high. Gary helped her achieve 2nd place in the 1989 World Karate Championships. She qualified as a swimming instructor and won a first-class degree in maths. In 1993, when she was 22, she and Gary got married, but her family still had reservations.
That which God has joined together, let not man divide.
It was as if I was at a wedding of strangers in many respects. He wasn't somebody that I could warm to at all.
But Sharon loved Gary. By the late 90s, the couple had 2 young sons and were living in a 3-bedroomed former council house in Hertfordshire. Gary also had a teenage son from his first marriage, who lived with his former wife. Sharon was working as a research officer, but the young family was not destined to be happy for long. Soon, every aspect of their life would need to be examined by the Metropolitan Police.
We're now on the estate where Gary and Sharon set up their last home together. Quite a quiet estate.
But for Gary, a quiet life on an ordinary estate wasn't on the agenda, nor was a steady job.
I always looked at Gary and I thought, he's a typical South London Arthur Daly.
Gary had found a quick route to the visible trappings of status and success: wheeler dealing.
Gary had made a lot of alterations to the house and extensions, even putting the dojo and the gymnasium in the premises.
He was very keen to get a swimming pool built in the back garden, and the swimming pool actually dwarfed the garden and filled most of it.
He'd made himself into what can only describe as a 1960s type gangster character, larger than life.
He wanted everybody to think that here he was, this big wheeler dealer. I think with Gary, you can sum it up as cash, not class. He couldn't see the value in small things unless they were diamonds.
He was financing this lifestyle through a new career. These were the early days of internet trading, and from a converted loft, he bought and sold highly valuable rare and vintage guitars, building a huge collection.
And he wanted to make a show of that to his friends, that this is how wealthy and how successful a person he was.
Soon his guitar collection was worth hundreds of thousands of pounds.
At one time, Gary went to America with a guitar, and apparently he paid for a seat for the guitar rather than have it put in the hold. So it sort of gave me some idea of what the value of these things really turned out to be.
But behind the scenes, Gary was in financial straits. Twice he claimed guitars had been stolen and received insurance payouts in 6 figures. He was secretive about his dealings.
He was a man who liked to control things, and he wouldn't even let his wife in the office, so she had no great knowledge of what was happening there.
Increasingly, tensions began to appear in his relationship with Sharon.
All Gary wanted to do was to stay indoors and not go out so much. And Sharon obviously wanted to go out, but then didn't feel that she should go out.
A deeper source of tension was over work and money. For all that Gary loved to flash cash around, he had no regular job.
He had this way, he had this ability to get people to do everything for him.
Sharon was working full-time. She was thinking of the future for herself and her 2 small boys. She began to put pressure on Gary to get a job.
Gary, for some reason, thought that it was a mug's game to work for somebody else. I think the fact that Gary never held down a permanent job, which gave a regular income, Sharon had a very, very strong feeling about that.
So strong that the couple split, deepening an increasingly dangerous divide. In the summer of 1999, Sharon took the boys and went back to live with her father. For her parents, it was a blessing because her mother was in the terminal phase of cancer.
It lifted Betty a little bit to think that Sharon was there and Sharon was able to sit with her and talk. The fact that Sharon was here was a tower of strength for me. I knew that Mum was being looked after.
Sharon also decided to retrain as a teacher. She found a job as a trainee with a nearby school starting in the new school year.
She felt that September was the start of a new life. It was certainly a new chapter in her life.
But her mother's condition was growing worse. Gary kindly eased her pain with shiatsu Chinese muscle massage.
Sharon would cry and say, you know, what's happened to Mum? And I used to say, you know, put the arm around her or give her a cuddle and say, look, it's not Mum there anymore. Your mum's gone. The cancer had hit the brain.
In August 1999, Betty died. The following month, 29-year-old Sharon started her postgraduate teacher training. She was planning a new life without Gary, though if she divorced him, she'd need a payout to cover her future with the boys. But little did she know that whilst she was preparing for life as a single parent, Gary had begun a new relationship with none other than Sharon's best friend from school and the karate classes, Paula.
I'd had a long friendship with Paula, but it developed into much more while Sharon was away. An affair started in September or October of '99.
But Gary was a man under stress. His marriage was on the rocks, and he felt the looming divorce payment would bring disaster.
Although on the face of it he was a successful man living in a substantial property with his guitar collection, he was actually in tremendous amount of debt. He'd got credit card debts that were well in excess of £100,000, and he was in trouble, he knew it, and was under tremendous pressure.
But Sharon was in the dark, and she was about to make a decision that would shatter her family forever. Sharon, a trainee teacher and mother of 2 small sons, had left her husband Gary after a series of rows and moved in with her father. Gary was out of work, massively overdrawn, and was having a secret affair with his wife's close friend, Paula. Sharon was about to hit him where it hurt.
In the autumn of 1999, it's clear that Sharon and Gary had discussed divorce. Figures that were involved are incredible, because Sharon had been offered by Gary a settlement in the region of £45,000, which was an absolute pittance.
When you consider that there was the family home that could be sold, valued around $400,000, and this really expensive guitar collection, she confided in friends that this is what the figure that she was being offered. She also confided in her solicitor, and solicitor and friends all urged her in the strongest terms to seek more than that, something in the region of £100,000 as a decent settlement. It's clear that Sharon told Gary, again in very strong terms, that he ought to auction some or all of his guitar collection to help meet that payment to her.
I made you an offer, that's all you'll get.
But Gary refused point blank to sell off his sacred guitar collection to provide money for Sharon and his sons.
Gary is a very possessive person. What he has is his. What he has, he wants to own. He won't part with anything. He would have fought it tooth and nail.
Police allege Gary concocted a plan to make sure that if Sharon took him to court, she'd win no sympathy.
Gary was very concerned to limit the amount of money that he would eventually have to pay Sharon for the divorce. And he went very, very devious to do all that he could to blacken Sharon's name.
Gary at one point instructed a private detective to try and catch his wife, allegedly with men.
It was the ultimate betrayal. He used Sharon's close friend Paula, with whom he himself was having a secret affair, to try to prove his wife's infidelity.
The plan was that Paula, his girlfriend, took Sharon to various local clubs and pubs trying to find a boyfriend that would be witnessed by the private detective. This wasn't successful, and part of the other means of trying to blacken her name was to tell friends and associates locally that she was selling drugs and also buying drugs. Again, this was never proven.
In October 1999, at half-term, and possibly because she too was manoeuvring for the pending divorce, Sharon made perhaps the most dangerous decision of her life. She decided to leave her father's house and move back in with Gary. She did it without telling her father, and whilst he was away. Things went badly from the start. As she and Gary shifted the boys' bunk beds out of her father's house, she had a fall.
Apparently, Sharon had slipped, hit her head at the bottom of the stairs and had to go to hospital. Did she slip? Or what?
Sharon had made the decision to move back with Gary after consulting her solicitor.
I believe she was told that it would be better if she was in the matrimonial home before she started divorce proceedings. It's far easier for the wife to keep the house and the children if she's actually there, whereas it would be very difficult to move back in once she started the proceedings.
The last weekend in November 1999, Sharon had a big day coming up on the Monday, a teacher's inset training session. She'd taken home 40 exercise books. Her Aunt Janet, a teacher herself, rang her on the Saturday night.
How are you, darling? You all right?
I said, how about the marking? She said, I have piles of it. I said, well, I did warn you.
But in the same conversation, Sharon spoke to Janet's daughter, Sandra. She indicated something had happened to set Gary off. She repeated she wanted a divorce.
There you go, sweetheart.
The next day, the family visited a neighbour's house.
Sharon and Gary went for a bit of tea with the neighbours and took the children. During that tea, there was some degree of upset and tension.
I'll bring the money in, don't I?
Afterwards, she came out on to this green where she was flying a kite with the children. Strange at that time of year because it's obviously quite dark. The last thing we do know about Sharon is that she had a telephone conversation a little bit later on with her childminder in regard to childcare over the next few days.
Yeah, see you next week. Take care. Bye.
But the childminder never saw Sharon again. Nor the next day was there any sign of Sharon at the school where she was expected for teacher training.
There There was a clear problem. Sharon hadn't arrived at the school in Hoddesdon that she was teaching at. She hadn't told the school she wouldn't be coming. Relatives hadn't heard from Sharon, and a number of them became very concerned about her welfare.
That Monday afternoon, Sandra, Sharon's cousin, called at the house.
She said, "Mum, I've got a terrible feeling." She said Sharon wasn't there. I said, "What do you mean Sharon wasn't there?" She said, "I got there and nobody was there." And then Gary came with the boys from the neighbours and said that Sharon wasn't there.
She didn't turn up for work today.
No, she's like, she's probably out with mates.
Sharon hadn't come home.
Gary telephoned Sharon's father.
Gary rang and said that, was Sharon here? I said, no. I said, isn't she at home? He said, no, she went out and she hasn't come back.
He said she'd gone to stay with friends in her maths group, taking her workbooks to prepare for the teacher training.
It was sort of funny, the way it came across, it was as though, oh well, it came across quite matter of fact.
Gary didn't call the police to report his wife missing until 2 days after the disappearance. On the Thursday, with still no news, Sandra called again.
When she got there, Gary said, "No, she's not here. She's not." And he said, "Come and see." And he insisted that she went in, and he took her round to show her through the house to prove that Sharon wasn't there.
There was no sign of Sharon, but Sandra did notice some of the wallpaper next to the bed had been stripped.
He said, "She's left." And that was the beginning of the nightmare, basically.
At about this time, Harry called the police to say there was no sign of Sharon.
I phoned them up, which was quite a shock, really. It's so matter of fact. And their answer was, well, she's over 18, she's every right to go missing if she wants to. Most missing people turn up within the first 6 weeks, 80% come back within that time, and we don't really take a lot of notice until after that period of time, which is a bit of a kick in the teeth when you're worried.
Gary told police he thought Sharon was with another man, but her family couldn't understand why she'd walk out on the boy she loved. And this was the run-up to the millennium. She'd been feeling her own life was swept up in the excitement, the sense a fresh start was possible.
She was in the middle of a teaching practice. It was important. This was the rest of her life she was organising. Life was beginning to look really good, really positive again for her. It was going to be a new century and a new start, was what she'd said.
I started then to think, had she had a breakdown? Had I missed something?
For Harry, Sharon's disappearance was a blow which came only 3 months after the death of his wife.
You get the guilt feeling, I did have the guilt feeling that I hadn't paid as much attention as I should have done. Had I been wrapped up in my own grief, not to notice anything with Sharon. And you get into the self-blame procedure within yourself. All I did after the first 4 or 5 days was sit in the conservatory looking at the front door and just waiting for somebody to walk up to it. You feel that they might be on the street. You even get to the stage where, and I did, that I'd even got my coat on. I was going to walk out the door. I was going to go up King's Cross and Euston and just see whether she was on with the down and outs. But you get to the front door and then you realise that what chance have you got of finding one person in London where she might not even be there?
I suppose we knew that something awful had happened somewhere along the line.
The month after the disappearance, police finally had a breakthrough. Sharon's car was discovered.
The car was found here in this small, quiet street. It's only about half a mile from where they live.
That was the beginning of the really, really low points. Up until then, I'd maintained that Sharon had, it may seem funny or silly, but in my own mind I thought, well, at least she's got the car, she's got means of coming home. When the car was found, then I thought she was on her own and in a very, very difficult position. And that's when I got some of my blackest thoughts of what could have happened, that she could have been abducted or something like that.
Gary had told police Sharon had had her phone with her. An officer checked the glove compartment to see if the phone was there. Then the car was given back to Gary.
The local CID were informed, and they then wished to retrieve the vehicle for forensic examination. A period of probably a couple of hours had passed by this point.
When detectives got the car back, they found it had been cleaned and vacuumed.
The reason it had been cleaned must signify that something had happened, but your mind then shuts down because you don't really want to know. I'd had a bad feeling from the word go when she disappeared. Now the car was found, it was beginning to realise my worst nightmare.
The officer who had previously searched the glove compartment found its contents altered.
And there were some items that weren't in there before, and they consisted of like a child's plastic beaker, had some white powder on it. There was a map book, a couple of sauce type containers, and 2 Durexes. And whether that is part of the story to continue the myth that Sharon was a naughty girl and had been planning to escape from Gary with another man, we don't know, but it didn't appear correct at the time.
Spots of blood were found in the boot. The house was searched and more spots were found in the martial arts room. Gary had an explanation. He said he and Sharon had been play fighting.
He said that Sharon had had a nosebleed, and in relation to the blood that was in the boot of the car, he said that Sharon had caught her hand on a baby's pushchair. But in both respects, the blood wasn't in sufficient quantity to make it suspicious.
In Gary's loft, police found the expensive guitars, and there were further discoveries.
During the search, it was also noted that the bedroom had been redecorated. The search then moved on to the gymnasium, and in there a number of books, possibly 30 school books, were discovered. These were the books that Sharon is alleged to have taken with her when she disappeared that night to have marked at the inset day the next day.
But there was no hard evidence of foul play. A month after the 29-year-old's disappearance, it was still a mystery, a missing person inquiry.
Gary was prepared to make a TV appeal begging her to return home, and that's the extent of his desire to show that she was still alive and that he believed that she
For wheeler dealer Gary, the heat was on. His wife Sharon had disappeared in November 1999, and detectives were closing in. They discovered the couple had argued over the amount he should pay her in a divorce settlement. In January 2000, the pressure became too much.
Next thing that happened was all of a sudden, no notice, no warning, Gary hired a van, packed it with some of his precious guitars, and some of those guitars he'd been paid out on in this false insurance fraud, put his 2 boys in the van and drove to Spain. This was a moonlight flip, no other word for it.
Gary being Gary wasn't content with the image of a Ford Transit. He wanted a top-of-the-range van from a local hire company. But it was paid for on what we call a bounce cheque, i.e. a cheque with no funds.
Paula was left back in England. On the way to Spain, Gary posted a series of letters. He wrote that he was at risk if he remained in the UK, and alleged Sharon had been in trouble with a gang over an unpaid debt and that she had a boyfriend.
I really did not believe any of it at all. I just thought he'd got himself in a little world of his own. He was in this fantasy world if he thought that that's what was going on.
In February 2000, Interpol found Gary's van. Detective Laurie Roach went to Spain to collect it. But under extradition arrangements at the time, Gary couldn't be brought back to Britain or even questioned without a warrant. But Gary's departure transformed the investigation from a missing person into a potential murder case, and detectives expanded their search for Sharon's body.
The area that I'm bringing to now is a very, very strange place. It's referred to locally as the Swallow Holes, and it's quite a vast area of wetlands. Now, this area is one of only 6 in the world, and it's a system of underground limestone holes, basically, which are covered in silty type mud. After Gary's disappearance to Spain, we began to search local areas, a possible site where a body could have been laid down or buried. This is within a couple of miles of the house. There's various areas come up where vortexes appear and objects can be placed in those vortexes, and they drift down through the watercourse system.
Police found nothing, but evidence was about to emerge which would confirm Sharon had not abandoned her 2 young sons.
As a father, you never will allow yourself to believe the unmentionable.
The whole idea of somebody killing somebody else is so out of what I would call a normal mindset. I couldn't even think for 1 minute.
The body was examined by myself and it was unrecognisable, mainly due to the weather conditions and exposure. Medical examinations revealed that it was the body of Sharon.
I just broke down and cried. That's all you can say. I'm just completely and utterly shattered. Because until then, and while a person is missing, they're not dead. And no matter what the circumstances and how people think, and everybody says, oh yeah, but you must have known, you must have known. Yeah, you most likely did know in your heart of hearts, but your brain won't let you accept that.
Devastating. Devastating. was your worst nightmare?
Cause of injury was given as blunt trauma injury to the base of the head, and that's caused by a ball-peen hammer.
Police instinct had been close to the mark. The spot is directly downstream from the swallow holes, searched earlier.
This is a watercourse flowing north. The tunnels in the distance take it onto the private estate. It's dry at the moment, but when the rain has built up, it can be very, very fast water.
A pathologist found multiple fractures to the face, jaw and back of the head.
What the pathologist was also able to say was that the blood hadn't drained to a particular part of the body, and he could tell from that that Sharon's body had been disposed of or secreted very soon after death.
Police needed to know where the body could have been hidden, so they searched upstream from where it was found.
The only place we could find was under the culvert, under the A1 motorway, because it was dry and it was concealed.
If this was the place, police needed to find who'd been in the vicinity on the night of the killing. They examined mobile phone records.
We got telephone records that showed that Gary was in an area close to that culvert by the side of the main road for as long as 3 hours on that Sunday night, and that during that time he'd made numerous telephone calls to Paula and to his son Gareth.
Records showed that later that night Paula too had been in the area for about 20 minutes. Gary couldn't be questioned because he was in Spain. He later claimed his presence at the spot was purely coincidental. But Paula was interviewed and had an explanation.
Gary had been out cycling, had got a puncture and had fallen from the bike, and that he'd rung Paula asking for some bandages and a puncture repair kit, and that she travelled out to that location to meet Gary and give him that assistance.
Paula claimed she arranged to meet Gary beside a footbridge over the A1, on the other side of which lies the culvert.
It's at this point on the entrance to the footpath that Paula says she finds Gary, and where she administers first aid in the form of a plaster and a glass of water.
Gary also claimed some of the phone calls between himself, Gareth and Paula were because he was trying to get her to collect Gareth from the London Eye, at the time a novelty in the run-up to its opening on Millennium Eve, and give Gareth a lift home. He said Paula had gone to fetch him. She'd dropped Gareth at the end of Gary's road and gone home. Mobile phone evidence does show that Gareth was at Gary's house for 2 hours that night. The police version of what happened that evening is very different.
This is what we believe happened in this case, that Gary, for the first time in his life, was actually being challenged by someone, in this case his wife Sharon. He painted a picture, assisted by Paula, to show that she was dealing with drugs, had boyfriends. This was not the case at all.
Something happened, something to do with the divorce, something to do with money, but something that Sharon said to Gary made Gary absolutely snap. Gary lost his temper and in that bedroom struck Sharon some fierce blows with a heavy instrument, which was probably a hammer, and then took every step he could to cover his tracks. One of those steps would involve removing the wallpaper from the bedroom walls.
This would explain the state of the bedroom as witnessed by Sharon's cousin, Sandra. Gary's son Gareth subsequently confirmed taking 2 bin bags, allegedly filled with paper, to an uncle's house south of the Thames. But he said this was some weeks earlier and that the bags contained documents relating to the investigation by the private detective.
Gary took his wife's body to an area of woodland near to the A1. The body was then concealed with the assistance of Paula in a culvert, where it was later moved through the stream systems into the place where it was found by the man on the private estate.
Piecing together a scenario for the murder was one thing, Picking up the trail of Gary in Spain and getting him to court was another. When he'd arrived at Fuengirola on the Costa del Sol, he'd initially moved in with an old girlfriend.
He went and stayed with her for a few days, which ended up being a few weeks, giving her the explanation that the police were putting pressure on him because his wife had gone missing and that she was a bad lady, well known in the area as a drugs dealer.
He'd then moved on to other apartments and placed his children in local schools. He didn't come back to the UK for Sharon's funeral or memorial service. Though many were by now convinced of Gary's guilt over Sharon's death, Harry still couldn't accept it, partly because of the kindness Gary had shown to Harry's wife when she was dying.
Although he had a very, very flary temper, he was normally very cool, calm, collective, and very understanding person. He'd given no end of help and hope to Betty during her illness. And I just couldn't at that time imagine that he was capable of doing that.
A year after the murder, Harry flew out to see him and take Christmas presents to the boys.
I couldn't believe that Gary would have done that to them. My whole belief was that if he's done it, then the boys have got nothing. He can't have done it. It was a sort of complete and utter denial that he would have done such a thing to the boys.
But Gary's demeanour in Spain changed his mind.
It was all poor Gary, not poor boys, they've got no mum, not what are the police doing to find the killer. All of a sudden, it all hit me. And I virtually cried all the way home. He was involved in what had happened to Sharon.
Gary sold the family home from Spain via his older son Gareth, but he was running out of guitars, running out of money. Finally, his time ran out too. Spanish police arrested him.
Whilst awaiting extradition in Madrid prison, Gary got married to a local UK resident who had been living in Spain and he'd been living with. This delayed the proceedings. Eventually I went out to Madrid and he was formally arrested and brought back to this country.
The Old Bailey was waiting. Gary, the wheeler dealer who'd been on the run in Spain, had finally been extradited back to the UK. But it wasn't only for the murder of his wife Sharon that he'd faced justice. Insurers who'd paid out £500,000 over the allegedly stolen guitars sued him and won. They took some of the guitars in compensation, others were given to Gary's family. In 2004, Gary pleaded not guilty to murder in his preliminary hearing at Hendon Magistrates Court. In his full trial at the Old Bailey in March 2005, Gary again denied murder. His son Gareth denied assisting an offender and intending to pervert the course of justice. Gary's lover and Sharon's friend Paula denied 2 counts of assisting an offender and 1 of intending to pervert the course of justice. But she confessed to a similar charge over the story about the jiffy bag. She said it was an alibi made up by Gary. The defence said there was no forensic evidence that Gary had murdered his wife Sharon, but the jury found the circumstantial evidence overwhelming. The stripped wallpaper, Gary's 3 hours on the night of the murder at the spot where the body had been dumped, his flit to Spain. Gary was found guilty and sentenced to life with a minimum of 18 years in prison. Gary's son Gareth was cleared, and the jury failed to reach a verdict on whether Paula had helped Gary, though she was given an 8-month suspended sentence and ordered to pay £1,000 costs for perverting the course of justice by lying to give Gary an alibi. Gary appealed, but only managed to reduce his minimum sentence by 2 years. A decade on, Harry is left with the pieces that remain when nightmare descends upon ordinary lives.
I've still got 3 boxes of Sharon's belongings or household things that are in the garage Just can't bring myself to get rid of them just yet. There's no real significance, it's just the fact that they are boxes ready for her to start up a new house that she was going to be moving into once everything was settled after the divorce. I can't bring myself to get rid of just yet. It will come, but what do you do? It's part of Sharon, unfortunately. And you never forget, and you never want to forget. That's really all it is. It's part of her life and part of my memories of her.
And the thing with Gary that sticks in my mind was he had absolutely no remorse for the actions he took against his wife.
Sharon's ashes were scattered at a local crematorium alongside her mother's. The family has so far left her resting place unmarked.
It's now time really to think for the boys and see whether they want to put stones and a memorial and enter it into the book of remembrance.
She really did no harm to him. Perhaps his ego, that she wanted to leave.
I think Gary was very, very devious, calculating man. I think he was tremendously materialistic, and I think that was at the root of the problem, the money. That's what made him do what he did, and I think that it was, he did everything he could, not only to cover his tracks, but to blacken the name of Sharon. And I think Sharon was a lovely lady and a very, very loyal and good friend, and an excellent mother to her children.
People sort of said, oh, don't you hate him, don't you do this, don't you do that? And I said, Gary really and truly is a non-entity. He doesn't come into it. It's only the children. It's an object, a non-entity.
This is really what I can't come to terms with, that she should not have been here. 29 years. Whatever happened to the 4 school years and 10? Or even 3 school years and 10 would have been a bonus. Life's sacred. If she'd lost her life in a war, you'd have grieved. You'd have seen the bigger picture, but money's not the bigger picture. Never.
Yeah.
On the edge of the Peak District National Park lies Sheffield, a city built on an honest and hard-working industrial past. But in January 2000, life for one community here would never be the same again.
In the whole of my 17 years with South Yorkshire Police, this is one case I will never forget.
For behind closed doors, this city hides the darkest of secrets that would shock, disturb.
This is actually the most gruesome body I've seen.
And shake the foundations of a small and respectable neighbourhood forever.
People who really wanted to know the truth, hoping that in fact this will be like a nightmare that will go away. But it didn't.
Sheffield, a city built on rolling hillsides, leafy, green and safe.
We're only about 2 or 3 miles from the Peak District, where we've got all that beautiful scenery and the Pennines.
From the national crime figures, Sheffield was recently recognised as being the safest city in the country, and it keeps that accolade year on year.
It's a safe place to bring up a family.
But a tragic story was about to unfold here, where greed and betrayal would send shockwaves through one close-knit community. In 2000, Kettlebridge Road was off the beaten track, quiet and undeveloped. On January the 22nd, friends Glyn and Chris were walking to a tool shop. when they spotted something out of the ordinary.
We were walking down just talking and laughing and joking. And as we were walking on, we just saw this pink cloth bundle, as it were. It wasn't hidden at all, it was in plain view, like just waiting to be found. It were quite new and clean, so we knew it had just been put there.
Could be worse, something.
Well, we undid the blanket, and inside blanket there were an old doll. We opened old doll up, which looked fairly brand new, and we took out put like a big plastic sheet, and that was all tied up as well. And it smelt of diesel. My friend, he says it could be an engine or an American horse saddle.
Thinking they may have found something of value, Glyn and Chris decided to examine it properly.
And it's about here, just here, where we actually opened bag. I couldn't really make out what it were because it was such a funny shape. It was just a weird shape.
They unwrapped the bundle and had the shock of their lives.
Chris.
And I touched top and it was all brown, like clay. I looked and could see it was a dead body. And that was it, that's the last time I won't look at it again.
Shaken by this gruesome find, Glyn immediately called the police.
My fingers turned to rubber. I'm trying to phone and trying to phone up, and my fingers were just, I just couldn't get them to work. It's like my brain didn't know how to work my fingers.
Yeah, police.
Detective Constable John Cousins was on duty at South Yorkshire Police that fateful night.
About 4 o'clock, the phone rang in the office, and it was one of the call handlers to say that somebody had found a package on Kettlebridge Road in Sheffield, and inside they believed they'd found a body. Obviously, we needed to get there as soon as possible to see what they found.
Within minutes, the police arrived on the scene to examine the contents of the bag.
It was curled up, sort of tucked up in a fetal position. Couldn't really see whether there was any hair or any clothing. So badly decomposed, we just had a quick look, and as soon as we realised that it was a human body, we backed away and left it where it was until the forensics team could arrive. That was probably the first time I'd seen a body that was so badly decomposed or in that state.
It wasn't only DC Cousins who was stunned by what he saw. 25 years in the force hadn't prepared Detective Bob Vary for what had been dumped in Kettlebridge Road.
Like most police officers, I have seen dead bodies on numerous occasions. This is actually the most gruesome body I've seen in terms of its decomposition. To achieve that state of decomposition, it would have been dead for a number of years.
The state of the body was in stark contrast to the condition of the bag it was in.
The bag itself looked very clean and new to look at. That certainly didn't look as if it had been there a long time, considering the time of year that it was.
It was clear that the person hadn't died there and had been actually put there.
A full-scale investigation was mounted by South Yorkshire Police.
But from my perspective, there were actually three major lines of inquiry. The first line of inquiry was the location where the body was actually found. The second line of inquiry was the body wrappings itself, the sheets and the plastic and the carrier bags. And the final line of inquiry was the body itself.
The decomposed remains were taken to the mortuary for a thorough post-mortem examination.
We weren't actually sure at that time whether it was a male or a female, and we certainly didn't know who it was or why it was there, or in fact how it had died.
Detectives were hoping the post-mortem would give them some clues as to who this person was.
Once we identified the body, then the pieces of the jigsaw would actually fit together.
However, identifying the body was to prove a huge hurdle.
The decomposition of this body extended to all the major organs. It was not just the flesh of the body. So we had difficulty establishing whether this was a male or a female.
But the post-mortem did reveal two vital clues about the person's history.
The lungs of this person were quite damaged and were quite black, which indicated that either they'd been a heavy smoker throughout their life or had worked in some kind of heavy industry.
There was some abnormality with the chewing surfaces of the teeth, but other than that, there was nothing from that first post-mortem.
After a second post-mortem, the police still had insufficient evidence to identify the body. The only way forward was to strip away the layers of decomposition and get under the body's skin.
We needed an expert in skeletons to become involved, and they defleshed the body that we had.
The corpse was stripped of its flesh and boiled for 3 weeks, and although extreme, the procedure was to provide police with their first real breakthrough.
From that skeleton, we were able to establish that it was a male. There was indications that the deceased had been subject to operations on both his feet, and this person was somewhere between 50 and 60 years of age.
The pathologist revealed that the operations on the dead man's feet were for bunions. He also found that the man had suffered from arthritis, and one of his fingertips was missing.
South Yorkshire Police had no record as to who this person might be. There was nobody missing that fitted this profile.
Still without an identity, the police concentrated on the wrappings in which the body was found. As it was discovered in winter, detectives believed the sheets around the body should have been significantly more weathered than they were. They were sent for detailed forensic examination. The soil and leaves found on the sheets were analysed by a botanist.
The botanist was able to establish that the body had been exposed to the elements in the autumn of the previous year, which gave us the clearest indication that it had been moved from the place where it died around about autumn of 1999.
As the body was found 3 months later, in January 2000, this new evidence confirmed to detectives that someone may have attempted to hide this man's death.
For whatever reason, this person's death had been concealed, and had been concealed for a number of years. And for whatever reason, that the body had recently been deposited on Kettlebridge Road. If that was the case, was there a more sinister reason for actually concealing this particular person's death?
By March 2000, the investigating team still hadn't identified the body, and the pressure was on.
So if we didn't identify the person, then it could well have been that we had to close the inquiry down.
The clock was ticking for detectives to turn this investigation around, and in a final attempt to crack the case, they turned to a forensic technique they had never used before.
This was actually the last throw of the dice, because there was nowhere else for us to go.
After 2 post-mortems, a defleshing and extensive forensic examinations, South Yorkshire Police were still unable to identify the decomposed human remains dumped by the side of a road in Sheffield in January 2000.
This was a unique investigation because we had an unidentified body, no crime scene, and no cause of death in the initial stages of the inquiry.
It was clear it was going to be difficult to find out who the person was and who was responsible, because the body was so badly decomposed. There was nothing at the early stage, once we looked at it, to give us a clue at all as to who this person could have been.
And so we turned to a new technique which had never been used previously by South Yorkshire Police.
The body's face was going to be reconstructed in clay from its skull by a specialist team from Sheffield University.
Facial reconstruction is generally the last resort and isn't used very often at all. But in cases where you've got an unidentified body and you don't have any DNA evidence or anything else that helps to identify them, facial reconstruction can make a really big difference.
Nikki Taylor was one of the team responsible for creating the face.
I'd never worked on a facial reconstruction case, certainly not a forensic case before, and so I was really excited.
Individual skulls are particularly unique and determine the size and shape of your features.
Whilst we can never get the defined features of someone's nose and someone's mouth, we can get a very good similarity, that we can get the shape of their face and get a good resemblance to that individual. We were able to establish that the skull was from someone of Caucasian origin, but that could be someone from the UK, but could also be someone from the Middle East. So we decided to make 2 different casts to cover those different options.
The painstaking process took Nikki and the team over a week to complete.
It's almost like a reverse dissection process, and we layer the muscles that are closest to the skull first and then the more superficial muscles on afterwards. Once we've got all of the muscles in place, that helps to give the face some shape, and then it's at that point we put on what we would call the skin layer.
It was quite exciting waiting for that to be done and to see whether or not, at the end of it all, we would actually have a face that we could work on.
While the face was evolving, a detailed examination of the skull's teeth gave the police an important new clue.
The surfaces of the teeth were actually extremely flat, and that was an indication that there was some type of constant chewing.
Arabic parts of the world chew what's known as catweed, where they continually chew quite often throughout the day, and that grinds the teeth down.
With this new information, detectives began focusing their attention on the clay head with the more Middle Eastern features.
Along with all the other medical facts they got, which indicated the ethnicity of this particular individual, it was becoming more and more apparent that we were looking at a member of an ethnic minority community.
On the 20th of March 2000, South Yorkshire Police finally came face to face with the man whose badly decomposed body had been discovered 3 months earlier.
When the clay head was made, we finally had an image. We had a face that we could finally put to this body, or give us a good indication as to what this person would have looked like.
Although their unidentified body now had a face, detectives still needed someone to recognise him.
The image gave us a fresh impetus with the inquiry and allowed us to go nationwide.
We distributed and publicised this picture as far and wide as was possible, including national television.
With such extensive publicity, the investigating team felt sure that someone would recognise the face, but no one came forward.
Facial reconstruction works on instant recognition, so we were of the view that either we would get him identified really quickly or we would never find out who he was.
In terms of publicity, we'd done everything that we could, all of which did not bring about the identification of this person.
Just as the police were giving up hope of ever establishing who this man was, the phone rang.
One afternoon, out of the blue, we had a call from a member of our staff, a person who was working for South Yorkshire Police, who thought he knew the identity of this particular individual.
Our colleague had opened a copy of the Sheffield Star and had seen the photographs of the clay head and the various pictures that we'd done and read the description, and on reading that he was quite shocked to realise it was very similar to somebody that he knew and from his community and who he'd not seen or heard of for a couple of years.
It was actually the first positive identification we got in the inquiry. It wasn't, I think it might be. He said, I am confident that that is Muhammad Nasser Ali. When you look at the picture and you look at the reconstruction that was undertaken, the similarity is absolutely staggering.
Now we actually had a name to work with, and this was a good lead and a clear lead for us to do some more inquiries and to establish whether or not this person was, had been the body that we had recovered.
With a name to work on for the very first time, the police began to look into the records of Mohammed Nasser Ali, a retired steelworker, who had come to live in Sheffield in the 1960s from the Middle Eastern country, Yemen.
Mohammed was a key member of the Yemeni community in Sheffield, very influential, very charismatic. He was very loud. He would be seen by people. Wherever he was, he would be noticed. And he tried his best to do the best for his family and even the community as much as he could do.
Mohammed was a very generous person and very likable to the community, and he was kind as well and a person of value. He's the kind of person that wanted to help people all the time.
But Mohammed had not been reported missing to the police.
It was important that we actually make contact with the family. And obviously that was with a view to establishing if he was still there, if this was a case of mistaken identity.
DC John Cousins headed straight to the address their colleague had given them.
This elderly lady answered the door. We showed our identification, made sure that she knew who we were and talked through why we were there. It turned out that she was divorced from Mohammed Nasser Ali and had been so for about 3 years. She told us that she believed he was in the Yemen or in Saudi Arabia.
Despite being confident that her ex-husband was abroad, Fatima revealed that Mohammed's medical profile was very similar to that of the unidentified body.
She confirmed that he'd had an operation to his feet because of bunions and also lost the tip of his finger during an accident several years ago.
Both of which were key characteristics of the dead man.
What Fatima was telling us was obviously quite crucial to the inquiry, so we telephoned that through to the incident room so that further inquiries could be done whilst we were speaking to Fatima.
Suddenly we were faced with what was a relatively slow time inquiry, picking up pace quite dramatically. The office staff were actually making contact with the GP and dentist to actually confirm the information that we already had. Everything was pointing very positively to the fact that this body that we discovered was in fact Mohammed Nasser Ali.
So you've not seen him at all? No.
However, Mohammed's ex-wife Fatima was insistent that he was abroad, and this was backed up by her son Hassan, who arrived at the house soon afterwards.
He told me that he was alive and well and living in Saudi Arabia, and I asked how he knew this, and he said that he had letters from him, and he showed us those letters.
On closer examination, DC Cousins could see that there was something not quite right about the letter supposedly written by Mohammed to his son.
There was writing on the letter that was obvious straight away. It was different writing, it was in different coloured ink, but he was adamant that this was from his father and he was alive and well.
And it wasn't just Mohammed's family that believed him to be out of the country. His friends and neighbours were also under the impression he was abroad, as he had not been seen by anyone for over 2 years.
Mohammed has always been a big part of the community, and at one stage he wasn't around anymore.
He just disappeared from the community.
The questions people were asking about Mohammed was simply, where is he? People will be told that he's in Mecca.
Mecca is a holy city in Saudi Arabia and the centre of the Islamic world.
It's very possible for a Muslim to decide to move to Mecca. And for someone in Mohammed's age, it's even more possible that that was the case. And people just simply left it at that.
Whilst many of Mohammed's friends accepted this story, others were not convinced.
People go to Mecca nearly every year from Sheffield, but no one said that he met them there. And for Muhammad to devote to be there all his time, I think it was a bit suspicious.
Back at the house, Hassan was helping police with their inquiries.
He gave us an identification card and a driving licence, which had a photograph of his father. Hassan got these items from a briefcase which contained a lot of documents, all sorts of things relating to his father and to himself, to money transfers from Sheffield out to the Yemen, and also we found a copy of a flight ticket in his father's name.
Presented with so much conflicting information, police felt they needed to talk to Hassan more thoroughly.
Hassan agreed to come with us to the police station whilst we were waiting for the results of the other inquiries that were taking place. Checks were being made at the GP practice for Mohammed Nasser Ali, and we hadn't got those results yet.
When that information finally came through, it proved vital to identifying the body.
We were given the news that the GP had confirmed that the details of his patient, Mohammed Nasser Ali, were similar to that of our profile, in that he had got a missing fingertip, he had had an operation on bunions on his feet, and he suffered from arthritis.
The police felt confident at last that they had identified their mystery body.
All the information we now had was pointing directly towards the body being that of Mohammed Nasser Ali. However, we'd got his son, Hassan, telling us that he believed him to be safe and well. Why would he lie?
After a number of interviews, police began to find further discrepancies in what Hassan was telling them.
There were some inconsistencies with his story because he'd jumped from him being in Saudi Arabia to him being in Yemen. He was telling us about the fact his father had wished to go out to get married, but he wasn't sure who he was getting married to. So there were one or two things just weren't ringing true about what he was saying.
Like the police, Mohammed's friends and neighbours had also been given conflicting stories about his whereabouts from his family.
Sometimes they said he's in Saudi Arabia, sometimes he said, okay, stayed in Saudi Arabia for a bit and then went back to Yemen. And some of the answers is in Oman. So they get like a mixed answer because people did talk.
Either Hassan was mistaken in what he was saying or he was telling lies. If he was telling lies, that would be a motive, in our view, to establish the fact that he knew something about his father's death.
With overwhelming circumstantial evidence all pointing to Hassan hiding the truth about his father's death, the police were left with no alternative.
Somebody somewhere wasn't telling us the truth. We weren't happy with what Hassan was telling us. So at that point he was arrested on suspicion of murder.
Using facial reconstruction, South Yorkshire Police had identified the decomposed body found dumped in Sheffield as 75-year-old Mohammed Nasser Ali. Detectives had still not established how, when or why he had died. Although his son Hassan had been arrested on suspicion of murder, he continued to insist his father had moved abroad.
He just kept continuing to tell us he's alive, and the body, he didn't know who that was, but it wasn't that of his father. Hassan even told us that his father had rung him from the Yemen back in 1997, and the fact that had he phoned, he must be alive and he must be safe and well.
News of his arrest sent shockwaves through the neighbourhood.
People in the community and even in Sheffield couldn't believe what's happened. I mean, a lot of members couldn't absorb it at that time.
People who really wanted to know the truth, almost hoping that in fact this will be like a dream, a nightmare that will go away, but it didn't.
At Attercliffe Police Station, just as detectives had reached stalemate with Hassan, another family member arrived who would blow the case wide open.
Hassan arrived, who was Mohammed Nasser Ali's grandson. I went out to speak to him at the front desk, and he told me that he wished to tell me how his grandfather had died.
17-year-old Kassan was Hassan's son. He was brought to the UK from the Yemen at the age of 2 and was taken in by his grandfather Mohammed.
Kassan, to some extent, used to respect his granddad, which sometimes we call him dad as well. Respect him very well, and Muhammad, at the same talking, he used to look after him and treated him like his son.
Mohammed brought Kassan up and was keen for him to get a good education. After separating from his wife Fatima, Mohammed moved 20 miles north of Sheffield to Doncaster and bought a house in his grandson's name.
He was generous with him. Kassan had what any child would wish to have at the time.
Kassan's father Hassan came to the UK in 1997 and moved in, but family life became strained.
When I spoke to Kassan in an interview, he was telling us that in October of 1997, himself, his father Hassan, had had an argument with his grandfather, Mohammed Nasser Ali, and that same night, following this argument, his grandfather had died during his sleep.
This dramatic turn of events had occurred after an argument over money. Since arriving in the UK, Hassan had been demanding handouts from his father, and Mohammed had had enough.
When Kassan said his grandfather had died in his sleep, bearing in mind his general age, that was actually a realistic prospect.
Whilst this explanation initially seemed reasonable, what Kassan went on to tell detectives made no sense at all.
He went on to say that they then decided to bury the body in the cellar of that address. We asked Kassan what was supposed to happen and what he should do when somebody died, and he just looked bemused. He was telling us a story which looked as if his grandfather had died naturally, and the only thing they'd done wrong was to dispose of the body in the way that they did.
The fact that they had hidden the body and not reported his death to the police aroused suspicions.
Why would somebody bury a relative in this way? Why would they have to conceal their body? If he died of natural causes, the proper and correct way is to notify the authorities and deal with the body correctly.
To verify Kassan's version of events that night, police needed to get Hassan's side of the story.
No comment.
We then interviewed Hassan further and told him what his son Kassan was telling us and what he was confessing to what had taken place. And at this point, Hassan then refused to speak to us anymore.
Yet again, the police had hit a brick wall, but overnight, events would take a dramatic turn.
The following morning when we got to work, we were told that Kassan wanted to speak to us some more. So we went for another interview with Kassan, and at this point, he changed the story again. Kassan told us that his grandfather hadn't, in fact, died in his sleep. He told us that he'd heard his father arguing with his grandfather, and this argument was getting more and more heated. Kassan explained that he went into the living room where this argument was taking place, and at this point he saw his grandfather laid on the floor with blood coming from his neck, and his father was holding a knife, standing over him.
Kassan went on to say that they dragged the body into the kitchen, where it was left overnight.
The next morning, they then cleared up the house, washing the knife in the sink, washing the kitchen floor, and they then placed the body in the cellar of the house.
Kassan's dramatic revelations left detectives astounded.
These were big claims that we were getting from Kassan. They were quite a surprise because from the previous day we'd got Hassan telling us his father was alive and well, and then we went to Kassan telling us all about how he'd died in his sleep, to now how his father had murdered his grandfather and he had helped in disposing of the body.
Detectives put Kassan's accusations of murder to his father.
Hassan was quite clearly shocked from what we were telling him, but he was adamant he wasn't going to tell us his version of the events. He stayed exactly as he had been by saying no comment to every question we asked him.
Because of Hassan's refusal to talk, police needed evidence to support Ghassan's story.
It was important that we actually try and corroborate what Ghassan was saying forensically, if that was at all possible.
Detectives raced to the house in Doncaster, the scene of the alleged crime.
At Palmer Street, we did find, with the help of forensic scientists, a trail of blood in the main living area, which led to the cellar head.
Ghassan had explained that he'd wrapped his grandfather up in a settee cover and then carried him down into the cellar of the house, where they placed him into a trunk and then built the tomb around the trunk.
Hassan and Ghassan had gone to great lengths to conceal that body. They'd actually made a makeshift tomb out of brick and then put flagstones over the top of that.
They then painted the entire tomb to make it look just like a structure inside the cellar.
As well as bloodstains on the lounge carpet, forensic scientists also matched foliage from the garden to foliage found with the decomposed body more than 20 miles away.
And significantly, we found propped up outside the house a broom, and on that broom was green paint. In that green paint was a fingerprint which ultimately was identified as being Hassan's fingerprint.
This evidence put Hassan at the scene of the crime and implicated him in the subsequent cover-up. However, he continued to deny everything.
Hassan didn't want to know what we were saying and just wouldn't answer any more questions from that point on. At the end of the interviews with Hassan, we asked him if he was willing to let his son stand alone for what had taken place, to which he said, "The truth will avail."
Whilst evidence was stacking up against Hassan, police were also starting to question Ghassan's involvement in events that night.
Ghassan also explained that the argument had also been about the transfer of the property of Palmer Street back into his grandfather's name from his own. He wasn't happy with this.
When detectives got hold of the deeds of the property, they found Mohammed had transferred ownership from Ghassan's name into his own. But they could also see the deeds had later been changed back again.
Ghassan had changed those deeds back into his own name so that he again was the owner of the property, and it appears that this took place after the death of his grandfather. There were documents which we could show had been forged by somebody back in the Yemen and sent through to the land registry here in the UK and to the solicitors here, quite clearly fraudulently.
With evidence of this motive for murdering his grandfather, detectives could see Ghassan was far from innocent.
It is clear that Hassan was the person who used the knife on him. But our view was that this was a joint venture and that it was a premeditated and planned murder to ensure their financial security together.
Ghassan throughout his interviews denied that he was responsible for killing him. But because of what he did, he was as guilty as his father because they clearly had conspired together to dispose of the body.
With proof mounting to support the theory that both men were involved in the murder, detectives were left with only one option.
As a result of all the evidence that we found at the house and because of the confessions that Ghassan had made, both men were charged with murder.
The family's friends and neighbours could not believe the nightmare that was unfolding.
The fact that Mohammed had died was in itself a shock. But even more shocking was the fact that it was revealed that his son and grandson had been arrested on suspicion of the murder. That was beyond comprehension. It really had a massive impact on the community.
Detectives had charged the two men they believed were responsible for Mohammed's death, but they still needed to clarify and prove their motive for murder.
At this point, we had a confession as to how Mohammed Nasser Ali had died, but we still didn't know why he had to die and how, 2 years later, his body was found at the side of Kettlebridge Road in Sheffield.
Three-month investigation, detectives had charged the son and grandson of Mohammed Nasser Ali with his murder. Police believe they had concealed the crime by burying his body in a tomb in the basement of the family house in Doncaster, where they had carried on life as normal.
Both Hassan and Kassan continued to live at Palmer Street in Doncaster for quite considerable time after they had buried their grandfather in the cellar. Throughout this time, whenever asked, Hassan was telling people who knew and wanted to know the whereabouts of Mohammed Nasser Ali the same story that he was telling us.
Both father and son had successfully kept up the pretense that Mohammed was living back in the Middle East.
I didn't notice anything about Hassan or Ghassan, anything that's different at the time. There just simply wasn't anything, to me, that would suggest anything untoward has happened.
But in the months following Mohammed's disappearance, some friends started to notice a difference in Hassan and Kassan's spending habits.
When we began speaking to people in the Yemeni community, we quickly realised that they had noticed a change in the lifestyle of Hassan and Kassan. It was noticeable that they had come to some money and were spending it.
But these friends had no idea what had gone on behind closed doors. Detailed investigations into Mohammed Nasser Ali's bank accounts uncovered a series of unusual financial dealings.
We found a treasure trove of evidence for the financial transactions that had taken place.
We discovered the fact that money had been, prior to his death, taken out from Mohammed Nasser Ali's account by either Kassan or Hassan, but subsequently, since he was murdered, his state benefits were being paid into an account to which both Hassan and Kassan had access to, and they used those funds.
This money trail also extended abroad.
We discovered a number of transactions for quite significant values, up to £6,500, going from the UK back to Aden in the Yemen, and subsequently on to the wife of Hassan, who still lived over in Aden.
We were able to establish that Hassan had started to build a house in the Yemen, and clearly the funds from his father's estate was going to fund that project.
Detectives also investigated the copy of an unused plane ticket to Yemen in Mohammed Nasser Ali's name, dated just before his disappearance in August 1997.
Those inquiries led us to a person that the Yemeni community used in Sheffield who would buy and sell tickets for people wishing to go back to the Yemen. He told us that he had purchased the ticket having been asked by Mohammed Nasser Ali back in August of 1997 for a journey he wished to take. He then received a phone call from Hassan stating that his father no longer to use that ticket, and because he had no reason to think otherwise, he managed to refund that ticket for them.
This planned trip to Yemen had been a cause for concern for Hassan and Kassan.
It appears that Mohammed Nasser Ali was planning to return to the Yemen, possibly to get married again and to set up a different life. Because of this, Hassan and Kassan realised that their source of income wouldn't be as good. They had already transferred money from his account without his knowledge, and I believe that once he found out about this, that is when the argument started, and that is what led up to his death.
Both Hassan and Kassan had a considerable amount of financial motive for killing Mohammed Nasser Ali.
Not content with living off Mohammed's benefits, savings and pension for nearly 2 years after his murder, and confident that they had got away with their crime, Hassan and Kassan wanted more.
It all started to go wrong when they decided to sell the house in Doncaster. They were obviously concerned about selling a house that got a body in the cellar in case it was discovered. So they decided that they would go and remove the body and dispose of it elsewhere.
Kassan's confession revealed how they had exhumed his grandfather's body from its makeshift tomb, and police corroborated this with the discovery of credit card receipts.
Kassan, following the instructions of his father, went to a DIY store where he bought some plastic sheeting, a shovel and some other items in order to remove the body from the house. His father had also told him to buy some diesel because he knew that that would hide the smell of the decomposition of the body.
March 2001, Hassan Nasser and his son Kassan Mohammed were tried for the murder of Mohammed Nasser Ali at Sheffield Crown Court. Both pleaded not guilty. Details from Kassan's signed confession led police to collect substantial forensic evidence, which placed both men at the scene of the crime and implicated them in its cover-up. This, combined with evidence of a series of financial embezzlements, resulted in a swift outcome. In just a week, both men were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison for an act that the judge described as violent and brutal.
It is rewarding when such hard work results in a conviction because it was a brutal murder and both Kassan and Hassan deserved their sentences.
It was extremely satisfying for the team to, first of all, identify Mohammed Nasser Ali, but even more satisfying to secure the conviction of the two people responsible for his murder.
For Mohammed's other relatives, friends and neighbours, justice had been done.
When they were given their life sentences, people were just glad that it was over. It was the end. For many people, the end of a really dark chapter in the life of the Yemeni community in Sheffield.
What Hassan and Kassan did was considered by a lot of Yemenis as insane, and the Yemeni community would not get over it easily.
And it's sad that a man like Mohammed Nasser Ali should end his life in such a brutal manner, with little or no compassion from the very close members of his family.
He did not deserve to die in the way that he did. He will always be remembered and will always be missed.
June 2008, in Brandon, a small and apparently peaceful town tucked between trees in Suffolk. Business as usual for the shopkeepers and families and office workers. But this isn't a normal day. And from the surrounding fields will come a danger which will shatter lives. A danger unleashed through a simple act of kindness on a shopping trip. The act of helping a stranger.
It happened out of the blue. 12 months on and I'm still struggling to get over it.
A stranger who used fear as a weapon, a means of control.
It's by far the most terrible experience of my life. I thought, no, I knew I was going to die.
He's kind of directing her thoughts. He's putting thoughts in her mind. So this is about power and abuse of power and mind control.
It's Saturday, 8 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. A 21-year-old girl, we'll call her Jane, has just finished shopping. The victim in the events about to unfold has been closely involved in the production of this documentary. We're making this film because of her courage during her ordeal and in wanting to tell her story to encourage other victims to come forward. The words spoken are hers, but to protect her identity, her role is being played by an actress.
Brandon is a nice, quiet little country town, market town, situated close to the Norfolk border, within Suffolk. It's surrounded on most sides by large forests, the main one being Thetford Forest. Many years ago it was an overspill from London, and at times there has been tensions between various communities within the town.
Has its own problems so far as criminality, but nothing out of the ordinary, and certainly the events of June the 14th, 2008 was actually shocking for the town, and no one actually could believe it.
I've always thought of myself as quite practical and sorted. When I was in school, I was in the Army Cadets, and thank God for that training, because that's what kept me going. I mean, without it, things might have turned out very differently.
Jane had spent the morning at work in a neighbouring town.
I'd come home, quickly changed into simple, casual clothes, and then driven to Tesco's in Brandon to get my weekend shopping. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I was going to take the food to the house I share with my boyfriend. I texted my mum to say once I'd put the shopping away that I'd then head over to their house, which is in a nearby village, and then I put the bags and my phone in the car.
But as she headed back to her car, she heard a voice.
Excuse me?
Just behind my car, another car was parked. There was an oldish guy in his 50s.
You couldn't give me a hand with this bag, could you?
Sure.
It's just that I've got a bad back.
I know all about bad backs. I sympathised. I've got a bad back myself. I could feel the bag was pretty empty, which I did think was a bit odd. Also, there wasn't much in the car either. The back seats had been folded down, so the boot was pretty empty.
Jane's offer of help, her willingness to be a Good Samaritan, was an act for which she would pay dearly.
Right, now you get in.
It was so terrifying. I went into a panic attack. I felt I might stop breathing, so I started hyperventilating and forcing the air down into my lungs.
He had the complete upper hand. He had all the power at that point. He'd come prepared, he'd used threats. Everything he had was either physically or emotionally overpowering Jane at that point. He knew the gravity of the offences he was committing, so he must have been confident that he was able to carry out that offence, and he must have believed that he was going to get away with it.
So at this point in time, Jane realises how powerless she really is. This is a guy who's prepared well. Despite how he looks, he's physically strong, he's got the element of surprise, and now he's absolutely terrorising her. So she knows that he holds all the cards, and this is all about the exercise and the abuse of power.
I was just sobbing uncontrollably.
Keep quiet!
But whilst my body was doing that, my mind was racing through a million different thoughts. Firstly, I was trying to use my Army Cadet training. I tried to check the time, but my watch had come off. And so I started trying to make a mental list of every stop and start, every turning we took, all the different types of road surface. I thought that by doing that, I could feel I was taking positive steps and I would get out of this alive. But then I was also thinking stupid things like what about the shopping? And also I was thinking I'd never see my mum and dad again for a hug.
Now Jane knows she's a captive. She's absolutely terrified. She's on a car going somewhere, she doesn't know where. So what's her psychological state like? Well, the first aspect of it is she is hypervigilant, picking up all the cues around her because she's trying to interpret them to give emotional significance to them. She wants to know what's going to happen to her. But she's trying to use her training to structure it up in some way, to remember more about the situation, so that if she gets freed, she'll be able to tell people about it. It's a kind of classic hostage situation. She remembers about the frozen food in her bag. It's this attempt to structure and control her thoughts, to stop them running away with her. She doesn't want to think the worst at this point in time. She's trying to think about the really normal things of everyday life, about will this frozen food, will it be usable when I eventually get freed?
Jane managed to worm her way free of the sleeping bag. Twice, fearing discovery, her attacker stopped the car to cover her up.
I thought about trying to escape, but I couldn't work out how to do that without getting killed. You know, because if I did manage to jump out of the car, then there was a good chance the car behind would just run into me.
After about 20 minutes, Jane felt the car turn onto a bumpy road.
What do you want from me?
You'll find out.
The car stopped.
I had the impression he was opening a metal gate. Then suddenly the rear door was opening and he took a white T-shirt and pulled it over my head. And then he got back in the car and drove on down a rough track.
So what's the psychological effects of this so far? He's abducted her at knife point. He's blindfolded her. He's taken her to a remote location. She doesn't know where she is. And if she were to escape at that point, where would she go? Who would she trust? So this is all about extreme disorientation and him exerting power over her. Now, why would he want to do that from a psychology point of view? Because he wants her cooperation.
Jane had yet to learn what cooperation with her attacker might entail and what further means of persuasion he might have in store.
After a few hundred yards, we stopped again. He turned off the engine.
Her journey was over, but the true horror was just about to begin. A summer's day in the sleepy Suffolk town of Brandon at the edge of Thetford Forest. For one 21-year-old girl, an ordeal which had begun there 20 minutes earlier in a supermarket car park was about to become far worse.
I was absolutely terrified. I was having panic attacks and difficulty breathing. I didn't know where I was or what was about to happen.
Jane is being played by an actress to protect the identity of the real victim. She wants her story told to encourage other victims to come forward. She'd been abducted at knife point and driven to an unknown destination by an older man who'd asked her for help, lifting a bag into his car. She'd willingly played the role of Good Samaritan. It was a trap.
He pulled me out of the back of the car. Again, he threatened me with a knife and then he untied my feet.
Blindfolded by a T-shirt, she strained every sense to try and work out where she might be. She felt from the breeze against her body that she was close to open countryside.
I couldn't really see anything in front of me, but I could see a little of the ground. I could see rocks. It was really rocky. And then I realised he wanted me to step up onto something, a reddish-orange milk crate in front of me. It was being used as a step up into something. And then I saw a silvery metal door frame.
Turn right.
Despite the pressure, she was still determined to remember every detail, potentially vital in bringing her attacker to justice.
I was aware of the floor echoing underneath my feet, so I knew I was in a caravan or a temporary building of some sort.
So Jane is now in the attacker's lair. He's got her exactly where he wants her, both geographically and, much more importantly, psychologically. He's got total control of her. She's nowhere to go. She's terrified. The only way out is for her to cooperate.
It was a bedroom, a tiny, stinking space with a bed covered in filthy, rumpled sheets and blankets. It smelt of his body odour, his unwashed skin, and it stank of smoke from cigarettes, overpowering. And yet there was lots of pink in there, as if it had been a girl's room. What do you want from me?
All I want is to make love to you.
When he used those words, make love to me, I was terrified and revolted, but it also made my flesh crawl. You know, this was a man who'd kidnapped me at knife point.
A man capable of violent mood swings, who had already demonstrated he was physically far stronger than Jane.
What if I don't?
See? What do you see?
Outside the window there was some grass, and over to one side there was water, possibly a lake. And in the middle of this grass, positioned exactly so I could clearly see it, were some mounds of freshly dug earth, and next to them was a hole.
What that is a grave. And if you're not a good girl, that's your grave.
Fear just drenched me. But what went through my mind when he said that, when I really thought he was about to kill me, was that I was absolutely determined to see my family again. I knew I had to do whatever it took to get back with them.
This is a horrible psychological move on his part. He shows her physically the grave. So he's kind of directing her thoughts. He's putting thoughts in her mind. So this is about power and abuse of power.
He became reflective. Mention of his life outside the caravan suggested to her he might be prepared to open up emotionally.
He seemed to want to keep talking, so I began to think that maybe if I appealed to his human side, then maybe I could get out of this. Why me?
Jane had been in the caravan with this man for quite a while, but she kept looking for sort of two things. One, she had the eye on survivor all the time, but she was also, looking for those little hooks that might improve her situation.
So I started to think of stories I could tell him that might persuade him to let me go. I told him my boyfriend will be coming back from Afghanistan and will be waiting for me. So would my family.
Well, this is classic captor-captive relationship here. What the captive has to do is to make the captor think of them as a human being, a rounded human being with emotions, thoughts, a biography, a narrative, a life. And of course, what the captor has to do is to think of them as a one-dimensional thing, as something they're going to use, in this case, to fulfill his fantasy. So what Jane did was exactly right, to get this guy to think of her differently.
I'm really sorry, but it's getting so late. I'm supposed to be going with my family to see my granddad. He's dying in hospital.
Now, of course, people who have to imprison people professionally, like prison guards, the army, whoever. They have to kind of bulletproof themselves from this process, because in some sense, if you're going to keep someone captive, you have to kind of think of them in a particular way. You have to control your thoughts as much as they have to do.
Have you got kids?
He wasn't trained to withstand this. So, in a sense, Jane did find his Achilles heel here.
I've got a wife, a son, a daughter and a grandchild.
I asked him more about his grandchild, and I saw the evil drain from his eyes.
This was a turning point in the ordeal for the victim, albeit very, very, very traumatic and scary.
After further conversation, Jane's attacker allowed her to get dressed, but she was still at his mercy, miles from anywhere and with the ever-present threat of his knife.
It certainly didn't mean that she was safe and everything else was going to be okay. These were serious offences. There was a lot at stake for this man, so she had no way of knowing at that point whether anything else was going to happen or whether she was going to survive this ordeal.
There was a moment when he thought about his wife finding out about what he'd done, and he started to panic. And I know I still might not get away. He knew I could identify him, and I was still really frightened he'd kill me. I was extremely nervous. Should have gone to Specsavers. I heard myself joking with him. That line from the advert. I was shocked to hear myself saying it, but I was just so nervy I didn't want the mood to change back again.
Are you going to tie me up again?
Not if you behave.
But he did put the T-shirt over her head, determined to hide the location from her.
Our sudden movements.
In the corridor, Jane saw only the cups and taps in the kitchenette. She was placed back in the car. Though he didn't use the rope, he once more pulled the sleeping bag over her body.
Jane's problem here is that she can't relax at this point in time. She knows her abductor is capable of dramatic mood changes. He's very volatile, very unpredictable. This is definitely the time not to relax.
One thought that kept me going was my parents. I was absolutely determined that I'd have a hug from them again. From my dad, my mum, my sister, and my boyfriend. It was a nightmare. I could not for 1 second let go of the fear that he might kill me.
Jane's attacker had from the start displayed dramatic mood swings, from threatening to kill her and showing her a freshly dug grave to being loving and intimate.
I heard the lighter. Immediately, my mind started racing. I was covered in the sleeping bag. I thought he might set light to the material and just leave me to burn. Then, after a few moments, I could hear the sound of a cigarette being smoked and could smell it.
Eventually, Jane's attacker's car left the countryside and pulled into an industrial estate.
He said if I moved my elbows, he'd come back and kill me.
Jane was back in Brandon, ironically having got herself into trouble by acting as a Good Samaritan. When she begged passers-by for help, none gave it. One woman crossed the street to avoid her. Eventually, she reached the nearest safe place she could think of, her boyfriend's parents' house.
I guess I could have gone to my car, but I just wanted to be with people I knew who could protect me. But there was no one there.
When her boyfriend's parents did return home 20 minutes later, his mother scarcely recognised her.
What's happened to you?
Jane blurted out what had happened, but her boyfriend's parents couldn't take it in. They called Jane's parents to tell them of the attack.
Where is she?
And they contacted the police.
At that point, we weren't to know that Jane was going to turn out to be what I describe as a perfect witness and When I say that, I mean that her power of recall and the detail of the information she was going to give us was going to be the driving part in this investigation.
Jane was taken to a safe house with her mum and her boyfriend's mum. She was eventually seen by a male doctor for a full examination, as no female doctor was available.
I was determined not to lose any evidence till the doctor arrived, so I didn't wash, despite the fact that my flesh was crawling and I was desperate for a shower. And I didn't go to the loo, even though I hadn't been since morning and it was now past midnight. After the doctor came, they said I could shower using their facilities and get changed.
Finally, she was allowed back to her parents' house.
I absolutely scrubbed myself raw when I got home as well. I even felt like shaving my head to get rid of the feeling that I could still smell my attacker. I insisted someone sat on the other side of the shower curtain because I couldn't face being alone. I kept having flashbacks about what happened.
The medical examination recovered body fluids believed to be the attackers. The samples were sent for analysis.
A partial DNA profile was obtained. Unfortunately for us, the fact it was a partial profile meant there was insufficient material to make an identification on the National DNA database to give us a potential suspect.
The next day, Jane gave a statement to police. Her interview lasted for nearly 9 hours.
So I had this white T-shirt on my head and he
She was able to give incredible detail of the course of events. Some really essential things that we were able to use effectively as we went through the investigation.
She described what she perceived to be the road surface, that every turn, a junction, stopping at junctions, for instance. The detail was immense.
Some details are remembered forever, and these things are called flashbulb memories. There's a very primitive bit of our brain which responds to a traumatic situation and says, never forget details of this situation, even when you want to. So aspects of the abduction, Jane would remember for all time. But of course, other bits are normally forgotten almost immediately. It's almost as if these things are too painful and we repress them. What's impressive about Jane is that those bits that we would normally repress, she has consciously said, I must remember those, because they're the bit that are going to help the police. So she's used force of will to remember bits that our brain automatically wants to suppress.
Even though my army training wasn't specific to anything I was experiencing, it gave me something to hold on to. I thought, what would my army trainers tell me to do in this situation? And I did it.
After the interview, Jane at last spoke to her boyfriend.
He'd been away all weekend and I hadn't been able to contact him. The first thing he said to me was that he loved me. That wasn't what I was expecting him to say at all. How could anyone love me or want me after what I'd been through? I felt like used goods, you know, filthed up and worthless. I allowed him to give me a little cuddle, but that was all I could stand. I just couldn't cope with the physical contact. And the strangest thing was, it was the same with my dad too. Even though what had been keeping me going was the thought of a hug from him. When it came to it, I just couldn't face being held. And it was so sad because this was Father's Day. That night, I just couldn't sleep. I couldn't get my attacker's face out of my head. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, I went to the bathroom and made a sketch of him on a notepad. I just wanted him out of my head and on the paper.
Police put together an e-fit based on Jane's description of her attacker. They began collecting CCTV footage, but there was no tape in the cameras at the supermarket that day. Officers made house-to-house inquiries and handed out flyers with descriptions of the abduction and the vehicle.
Jane gave us some really good detail regarding the vehicle she was taken in. She was able to give us what she thought was the make and model, age of the vehicle, how the seats were put in the back, the way the door opened. She was able to describe the spoiler at the front and the spotlights that were on the spoiler. We thought at that point that would be a really useful lead for us and something that we could work on. Unfortunately, when we started to look at the number of vehicles in that age category, just in that Brandon area of that make and model. We soon realised that was an uphill task in numbering hundreds of vehicles.
Fortunately, detectives had the rich store of further detailed information from Jane.
One of our main tasks was to determine where the offence might have occurred, where this caravan was. We knew the starting place was Brandon. Jane said that the journey time was 20 to 25 minutes.
Officers were dispatched from Brandon to drive for that amount of time in every direction.
We then drew an outer limit. We checked that with the route finder capability on the internet. That gave us about 450 square miles.
They needed to narrow this large area down. The flat Suffolk countryside round Brandon is home to RAF and United States Air Force bases. Detectives quickly established there was no way the attacker had a caravan on their land. Big private estates were also eliminated, as were built-up areas, because Jane had described the location as rural. But a vast area remained. Detectives attempted to follow Jane's detailed list of twists and turns.
This is Tesco's in Brandon. This is the Rattlers Road entrance to the car park. And you can see that red fence over there. Towards the end of there, that's at the end of that fence in a parking space is where the suspect abducted the victim from. And the victim's perception from the movements of the vehicle was actually exited via the London Road exit, which is to our right over there.
But following Jane's list to the letter failed to match geography on the ground. Police began to wonder if her attacker's manoeuvring in the car park had disorientated her from the start.
Very quickly it became apparent to us that it must be very, very difficult to actually know whether you are turning left or right, or whether you've stopped at a junction. If your senses are blindfolded, under immense stress from just the sheer terror of being abducted like that at night point.
Jane had mentioned hearing shooting, and the public responded with information on local gun clubs. But there turned out to be quite a few active on Saturday afternoons. Police also asked about old caravan-style homes, but no one had seen any. Detectives needed a different tack.
We utilised the Suffolk Police Force helicopter and indeed actually did a search based purely on what the victim had given us from the interview.
Jane had mentioned key details that might be visible from the air. The mobile home itself, dark soil colour, rocky ground, and the vehicle.
We found a similar vehicle, what we believe to be hidden up in a wooded area, in some rough land, well hidden off the road, and was quite exciting at that stage, but it needed checking out, and we checked it out and soon eliminated it from our inquiries.
The first helicopter search had drawn a blank. For the second, the plan was to focus on Jane's recollection of water near the caravan, picking out canals, rivers, lakes. The team moved to the area immediately north of the patch searched first, and 10 miles from Brandon, in a remote area near the village of Hockwold-cum-Wilton, they made a discovery.
We did identify premises which seemed to have all the key ingredients that the victim had described, the track leading to it, the fact there was a metal gate some way down this track, and then the track continued on to actual fact where there was a mobile home.
And there, visible from the helicopter and tucked beneath the mobile home, something which appeared to match a key detail recalled by Jane, the reddish-orange milk crate at the doorway. Trevor and his investigation team needed to check out the location on the ground. Once again, they drew on the detailed information provided by Jane.
She described a certain length of time on the road and then turning off on a bumpy track like this one here, and driving down this track for a certain length of time. The victim describes that she's taken out of the vehicle at the sexual attack scene, and her head's covered, but she can feel the wind around her face and her body, and has got the perception that she's in open countryside, just like sort of we're in here now. One piece of the jigsaw at a time, and a place fitted exactly. And as you can see, just ahead of us here
where those trees ahead are where she was taken.
The mobile home, spotted from the air, had trees at its back, but in front was an expanse of lake and open countryside. The team of officers approached.
We had a meeting beforehand to make sure we had all our plans in place, just in case the suspect should come back. When we were there, we couldn't get in, we needed to secure it. So that when they did actually go, we knew that we could deal with whatever situation we came across.
You're entering into the unknown. Who knows, the offender actually might be inside there. So, you know, you're going with that in your mind.
The caravan was exactly as Jane had described.
When we looked through that caravan window into the bedroom area, I was 100% certain we'd found our scene.
Trevor was on the phone saying, I've had a look in the window, and from what Jane had told us in interview, he was really certain that was the caravan. And he said to me, having looked in the caravan, he'd had to sort of take a couple of minutes just because of the detail of a description of what he'd seen. There was just no hesitation on his behalf that we had the right place.
It just had to be it, and it was an immense feeling because it actually put us one step closer to apprehending our suspect.
Police spoke to the owner of the land. It turned out he'd already phoned them after seeing the description of the attacker, one of 200 calls they were still working through.
He had his suspicions that somebody who worked for him matched the description we'd given out, not necessarily the EFIT, but at least the descriptions, even to the extent that he'd sort of ticked off the various points we put on the description against the person working there.
The caravan was used by a man in his 50s, the water bailiff who looked after the lake. His name was Robert English. He was tracked down to an address in Norwich. He was also linked to the vehicle used in the abduction. He was arrested as he left his house. Police hoped they had their man, a profound relief to Jane. But her nightmare, which began with abduction and continued with rape in a filthy caravan, was not over.
I feel I've been betrayed by the justice system. So now I'm left not only dealing with the trauma of past events, but with the fear of what might happen next.
A police helicopter search identified the grimy caravan where it was alleged the assault took place. English was a water bailiff, guarding the fishing lake nearby. Jane, whose part is being played by an actress, had remembered a wealth of detailed information, helping police identify her attacker.
If at any time you feel uncomfortable or you want to walk around...
English was taken to Bury St Edmunds police station, where he was questioned for nearly 7 hours.
The interview with Robert English was vital for us, and there was a great deal of planning that went into that before we actually started.
We suspect you that on the 14th of June at Brandon, unlawfully and by force, carried away against her will. Okay, that's what we're saying that you are responsible for.
I chose to monitor that interview as it went on by use of a video camera within the room that I could watch from a remote location, so that we could look at body language, we could look at his response to questions to make sure we were going in the right direction, that we were picking up in those issues which seemed to rattle him, if you like, and get reactions.
Initially, English denied everything.
I've got nothing to hide, so you'll only ever hear the truth.
Okay, well that's all we're here for, is to hear the truth.
He was quite happy to talk to us at that point.
Now, the offences of kidnap and rape, how would you view those offences as a person sitting here arrested on suspicion of those offences?
Awful.
Sorry?
Awful.
Awful.
We, first of all, allowed him to give his life story to us, to say, you know, right back from school, really, to build up to the current time as to what he'd done. I don't think he felt under too much pressure. We were asking fairly friendly questions. We weren't hitting him with the evidence of the offences themselves.
The purpose of this interview is to get your version of events, to get your account.
The technique was to feed Robert English rope so he could hang himself. Once he'd given enough information, police cut off his escape routes.
He'd already come out with a set story that he wanted to stick to, which we can then challenge the facts on.
When they asked if he'd ever been to Brandon, he said no, but police had been contacted by a woman who'd seen the e-fit. English had shown her round the lake the Friday before the attack, and she'd later seen him looking around Tesco's in Brandon the night before the abduction in the car park. Also, he said he'd returned home early that afternoon, but CCTV footage showed his car passing through Brandon as he returned to drop Jane off at 6:30 p.m.
At that point, his attitude to us changed completely, and from speaking fairly openly to us, he decided then not to answer any of our questions.
But police had other evidence. Jane had identified English at an ID parade. There was the partial DNA match, and crucially, when English was examined, there were the mole and cigarette burn exactly as she'd described.
At the end of that process, we felt we had sufficient evidence to charge him with kidnap, with false imprisonment, and with a number of rape and sexual offences.
The police operation was unbelievably efficient. They tracked him down and left him no escape. And right from the start, they were incredibly kind and understanding. I know a lot of rape victims fear to come forward because they worry about how the police will treat them or about low conviction rates for rapists. But after my experience, I would absolutely urge any victim to contact the police. It's the only way to get rapists locked up so they can't do it again.
English was tried at Ipswich Crown Court, where he pleaded guilty to kidnap, false imprisonment, sexual assault, assault by penetration, and 2 counts of rape. He was sentenced to life and told he'd have to spend a minimum of 7.5 years in prison. For the police, this was a job done. They were commended by the judge.
From when the offence was reported to us to the time we charged Robert English was just over 4 weeks. And in that sense, there was a real team pride in being able to bring that person to justice in that timescale. And also some relief, particularly on my behalf, that we managed to find the person responsible for that crime, knowing that they weren't then free to be committing crimes against other people.
But for Jane, the fact Robert English would be released in a few years was a worry, and it didn't seem adequate after abduction at knife point and the extended sexual assault.
When he was put behind bars, I felt relief. Although I wasn't too happy he could be getting out in just over 7 years. I'll be living with the trauma of what happened for the rest of my life. For months I had panic attacks. I jumped if anything sudden happened. I was wary of every man on the street. It also made it extremely hard to rebuild a loving relationship with my boyfriend and to try and lead a normal life. But I was getting somewhere with that. But that wasn't the end of the story.
Robert English decided to challenge his minimum sentence. He got it reduced by the Court of Appeal to 5 years, 4 months.
That meant he'd be out in 4 years, 4 months, given the time he'd already served. I couldn't believe it. I felt betrayed. I can't fault the police in any way, but I feel so badly let down by the courts. How viciously does someone have to treat you before they're locked up and put out of harm's way? How am I supposed to cope when that man is released and I have to live with the fear he'll come looking for me? All I have left is to campaign for sentences, not just in the case of Robert English, but for all such rapists, which actually take into account the damage they've done and put the victim first.
But I think the sentence is really important because it reflects society's judgment on the seriousness of what's happened. Jane has bared her soul here going through the trial, and she wants to feel that society empathises with her and understands how genuinely traumatic this was. And I think the problem is if the sentence is not adequate, she will feel that people didn't kind of get it, they didn't understand it, they didn't show enough empathy with what she'd been through. And I think the point about justice is it's an absolute core bit of the human psyche. It's really important that our version of events and our account of our suffering is accepted. If not, and if you think that the sentence is not adequate, It's almost as if you've been a victim twice and nobody wants to be that.
At the end of the day, this was an evil, terrible thing that happened in the most mundane of surroundings. English told me why he did it. He said he'd seen me in the supermarket and he just had to have me. I mean, obviously he'd carefully planned to abduct somebody, but he chanced on me. It was that simple. I was dressed in ordinary clothes on an ordinary shopping trip, and my world became a nightmare. Knowing that, going anywhere, anytime, feels a risk. But when Robert English is free, how will I ever be?
Above a pretty pub in Nottingham, 20-year-old Matthew Pike and his 21-year-old girlfriend Joanna created their first home together.
It was obvious that they really loved each other deeply, and she was so good for him.
As well as studying at Nottingham Trent University, the couple ran a website forum for fans of a computer war game.
The people got to know each other very, very well on there, although they probably never physically met each other.
But Matthew and Joanna had no idea that the website forum would open their lives to an evil stranger.
I didn't know any of the problems they were having. I wish Matthew could have, sort of confided in me and said, look, I am having a problem.
A stranger who would tear their lives apart.
This developed into one of the most extreme cases of stalking that I've ever witnessed.
Because what began as stalking was to end in a gruesome murder. Stowmarket, a small, picturesque town in Suffolk. This is where Kim and William Pike decided to settle down and raise their two sons, Matthew and Adam.
Matthew was an easy child. He's sort of laid back and happy, always smiling.
Matthew Pike was born on the 23rd of August 1988 and was the baby of the Pike family.
Matthew was quite shy and reserved, but he had a really wicked sense of humour. You didn't have to amuse him, he'd amuse himself, and he'd spend loads of time on the computer.
Matthew's passion for computers and playing computer games began at an early age.
We've always had some kind of computer or games console in this house. I was looking at a family video the other day, and Matthew was about 4 or 5, and he was playing on my mum and dad's really old computer, even at that age.
Matthew is very talented with computers, without a shadow of a doubt. He invented his own little programs, his own little games here and there, stuff he'd put on the internet.
By the time he was in his late teens, there was one game in particular Matthew loved to play, a war game based in a fantasy world where players used cunning and tactical strategies to defeat an enemy army.
Advance Wars really was, from what Matthew had told us, was sort of like a more technical game of chess, basically. You'd have your army and you'd set out your pieces, just like a chess game, really. And you'd sort of battle other people from around the world on the internet and sort of build up your army as you went along, really.
Matthew shared tips about playing his favourite game with other players on the internet, including a 17-year-old girl called Joanna from Selby in Yorkshire. The pair hit it off.
I think he was a bit embarrassed that he'd met her online and wanted to meet her face to face. So when he went up to York to meet her, he didn't actually tell us that that was what he was doing. He told us that he was meeting a friend, and we assumed it was male, and that they were going to a concert in York.
Romance blossomed, and it was soon time for the couple to meet each other's parents.
I thought she was lovely. She's stunning to look at, and she was into computing, which was, as far as Matthew was concerned, a bonus. We hadn't been prepared for the fact that they would become a couple so quickly and be so happy together, but it was obvious that they really loved each other deeply, and she was so good for him.
Joanna did wonders for Matthew's confidence, and when university beckoned, They decided to head to the same city so they could be together. Matthew and Joanna chose Nottingham Trent University. After a year, the couple moved in together and continued to share their passion for computers. With an online friend called James, they set up a website forum called Wars Central, where fans of their favourite tactical war game could share tips.
There were a hardcore of individuals, probably 50 or so, that were regularly on the site.
The website forum became central to the lives of this group of young computer gamers, and their online chats were not limited to advanced wars.
Some of these people were online all day, every day. They lived their lives through it. It seemed they talked about everything from relationships to families, holidays, politics, their studies. Nothing appeared to be off limits.
The forum members felt they knew one another, but the reality was they were putting their trust in strangers, most of whom they knew nothing about and had never met in person.
People need to think, when you make friends online, just who you are inviting into your life.
The website members had usernames to give them some level of anonymity. Matthew was called Shade and Joanna went by Jojo. But as a young woman who was passionately interested in tactical war games, Joanna stood out in the forum.
It appeared to be quite a male world, but Joanna was definitely the matriarch. She was up there. She was the leading lady.
And Joanna quickly attracted the attention of a forum member whose username was Eagle the Lightning.
Matthew, Joanna and most of the forum members knew very, very little about Eagle the Lightning. They knew he was German and his first name was David. They didn't know any more than that.
David told Joanna that his parents had both abandoned him when he was just 10 years old and that he now lived with his elderly grandmother.
Joanna herself was particularly compassionate towards him and entered into sort of private conversations with him to try and bolster his confidence.
But Eagle the Lightning quickly wanted much more than Joanna's friendship and compassion.
David truly believed that one day Joanna would be his girlfriend and they'd end up together.
Eagle the Lightning knew Joanna was Matthew's girlfriend, but that did not deter him. And the more he found out about Joanna on the internet, the more obsessed he became.
He said that he liked her, and he'd liked her for a long time, but that when he saw her picture on Facebook, he decided that he was in love with her.
David had a real thing for redheads. He considered them to be superior, more intelligent, and Joanna was David's perfect woman.
David told Joanna about his growing feelings for her, and she immediately tried to end his infatuation.
She told him that she was deeply in love with Matthew and she had no interest in anybody else.
But David refused to take no for an answer. He loved Joanna and he was determined she would love him back. Without warning, on the 3rd of May 2008, a document appeared on the forum from Eagle the Lightning. He had posted a love letter to Joanna for all the members to see.
It was 2 pages of A4 declaring that she was the first thing he thought of when he woke up in the morning and the last thing he thought of when he went to sleep at night, and how she'd changed his world.
The declaration also said David loved Joanna more than anything else in his life, even though he'd never met her in person. Eagle the Lightning had become completely obsessed with Joanna, and there was nothing she could say or do to stop him. In May 2008, students 20-year-old Matthew Pike and 21-year-old Joanna were living together in Nottingham. Both had part-time jobs.
They liked quiet things. They weren't a pair for going out to the pub and getting drunk or anything like that. They would go for walks. They were just happy in each other's company.
From their flat, they had set up and ran a website forum called Wars Central, but one of its members, 21-year-old David, known online as Eagle the Lightning, had become completely infatuated with Joanna.
He would ask things such as, "Where is Matt? Is Matt with you?" And And it was those sort of things that she found not appropriate. So she would very quickly try to cut that off. This isn't the time for us to talk about anything to do with you and me. There is no you and me. Just focus on what we are here to do, which is talk about the games.
The young couple had no idea Eagle the Lightning was painstakingly finding out information about where they lived.
What he did was ask various people about Joe and Matt. So, for example, whereabouts in Nottingham do they live? What sort of street is it? So, over a period of time, he began to pen a picture of where it was that they lived.
He knew it was above a pub. He also knew there was a park nearby, and he was a user of Google Earth. It wouldn't have been difficult for him to locate that flat. But I think the final clincher was when he led to one of the other users to believe that he knew so much about the location of the flat that the other user actually confirmed the address.
Through his detailed research on the internet, Eagle the Lightning also knew the couple had gone on holiday to Devon with Joanna's parents. He decided to plan a surprise for them on their return home to Nottingham.
They received text messages while they were away that suggested David was going to be coming to Nottingham. And James actually gives them what he refers to as a heads up that Eagle the Lightning was intending to travel.
Hey Joe, ETL is going to...
But Matthew and Joanna thought it was a joke. Surely a stranger wouldn't travel hundreds of miles to another country uninvited just because he had a bizarre crush. Especially a stranger who had no idea where they lived. On the 21st of June 2008, the young couple arrived back home in Nottingham.
They were approached by an individual. They didn't know him, and this individual says to them, "Hello, I'm Eagle the Lightning from Germany."
The forum user turned stalker had arrived unannounced and uninvited outside the couple's home.
When Matthew and Joanna first met David, they were very polite towards him. They felt a little bit embarrassed about the situation, but they were typically British about it and offered him some hospitality to make him not feel so unwanted.
Matthew and Joanna found out Eagle the Lightning's name was David Heiss, that he spoke perfect English and that he didn't intend to fly home to Germany for a month.
She was upset about it, but Matthew felt sorry for Heiss. It was him that suggested that, you know, he's come all this way, let's be friendly towards him, and convinced Joe that Heiss should be invited into their flat.
But it appeared David Heiss expected more than hospitality. The virtual stranger expected to stay with them. But Joanna was determined to get him out of their flat as soon as she could.
Have you got any rooms to talk for tonight, please?
Joanna called 20 hotels and hostels.
Oh, really? Not at all.
But there were no rooms available in Nottingham for that night.
Right, okay, thanks anyway.
The uninvited visitor had to stay with them or sleep on the streets.
There was a conversation that her and Matt had about where they could send Heiss. And it was Matt that suggested that for one night only, they allow Heiss to stay.
But the size of the couple's studio flat meant their unwelcome guest had to sleep right next to their bed. Joanna was deeply uncomfortable with the situation.
She barely slept that night. She recalls waking up and looking, and Heiss was awake and staring at her. So that spooked her as well.
David Heiss watched her all night long. Joanna ensured David did not stay a second night. She found him a hotel room.
Hi, is it possible to book a room, please, for tonight? Oh, you have?
The couple were determined to do whatever they could to stop David Heiss staying in Nottingham for a whole month.
Already at that point, they were sending messages to other gamers about Heiss and the fact that they thought he was somewhat unusual and that they were trying to work out what to do with him.
Heiss's intentions during his time in Nottingham were clearly to spend as much time with Joanna as he could, even to the point that he would ask Joanna in front of Matt if there was any chance of him spending any time with her, with Matt not being present.
David could see his behaviour was unnerving Joanna and tried to justify his actions.
During the time that Heiss stayed in Nottingham, he wrote letters to try and convince Joanna that he wasn't weird and to try and justify the reasons for his behaviour and to tell her about the fact that he'd been discarded by his parents.
Joanna became more and more uncomfortable, but after a week they were able to send David Heiss on his way without offending him.
Between them and the gamers, they came up with a plan to keep Heiss away from them. They suggested that he travel around the country to go and visit some of the other gamers.
David Heiss had finally left Nottingham, and Matthew and Joanna were able to put the strange incident with the German forum member behind them. No one outside the forum, not even Matthew's nearest and dearest, had any knowledge of the bizarre encounter.
He seemed happy. There was no inkling that anything was wrong or upsetting him. He just seemed a normal Matthew. He would be difficult to get information out of on the phone. We would have to question him. Just the normal mum things. Are you all right? Are you eating? You know, are you looking after yourself? Are you washing clothes? That kind of thing.
Matthew believed he had looked after himself and Joanna by moving their uninvited visitor on, but little did they know that after meeting Joanna, David Heiss had become even more obsessed.
The thoughts that dominated his mind at that time were all about Joanna and him being with her.
The more forum members who met David Heiss in person, the more his behaviour became a topic of conversation.
People having met him now think there's something really quite not right. They all found him a bit unusual. None of them liked the idea that he clearly was becoming besotted by Joanne.
Nothing anybody would say to David would have got him to change his mind about his feelings towards Joanna.
And David Heiss quickly learned that his fascination with Joanna and eagerness to discuss her online was a hot topic on the forum. He was being described as strange.
David didn't really like people discussing him over the internet, and this made him angry.
Heiss is already beginning to develop the feeling that they are ostracising him from the group.
But Eagle the Lightning wasn't the only forum member who was becoming angry about the situation. Matthew was becoming increasingly frustrated about David's obsession with his girlfriend.
On the 22nd of July, Matthew generates a document. It's a document referred to as the 19 Reasons. And the 19 Reasons is a list of things that he puts together that indicates why he hates Eagle the Lightning.
I hate the way you meddle, the way you never let something rest. I hate you because you tracked us down and intruded on our lives. I hate you because no matter how many times we invited you in, you barely said a damn word. I hate the way you endlessly plug Joe, when I can see how annoyed you get. I hate you forever laying eyes on the woman I have dedicated my life to.
The 19 Reasons reveals in no uncertain terms exactly how Matthew felt about David Heiss, his infatuation with his girlfriend Joanna, and his unwelcome visit to the UK. Eagle the Lightning had blatantly laid his cards on the table in terms of his feelings for Joanna, and in return, Matthew Pike followed suit. But he only emailed his attack on Heiss to a few friends on the forum, not to everyone.
It took a lot to upset Matthew or to get him angry. He'll take so much and stay calm, and then he would explode, but it was very, very rare. He hated confrontation, he hated arguing.
But David Heiss soon learnt of the 19 Reasons document and was furious.
His reaction to that is clearly very, very angry.
And he could not understand why the website forum was siding with Matthew.
Most of the forum members believed David's behaviour towards Joanna was unacceptable. However, David believed he was right and his behaviour was proper.
He would start to prolifically defend his corner, and he would then become increasingly aggressive. He wouldn't leave a conversation just leave and walk away. He was like a dog with a rag. He wouldn't let go. People had to block him in order to get rid of him.
Even after the forum members blocked him, he still thought he was doing nothing wrong.
David's behaviour resulted in him being banned from the website forum, and because his whole life was online, the repercussions were devastating.
To be blocked out of a conversation where everybody else was involved would lead to enormous paranoia. Horrendous. It's like all your friends refusing to answer the phone to you. It could be seen regularly, individuals saying, please, please let me back in, begging to come online, and all the rest of the users chuckling and refusing to let them back in. It's really quite something quite damaging.
And David Heiss believed there was just one person to blame for his exclusion from the website forum.
Heiss thought that it was now Matthew that was generating the problem between them, and clearly he was trying to reflect that with other gamers. The response from them was, just forget it, just leave it all alone. But we also know that he began to indicate that was something that was making him so angry that he'd got to come back to confront Matthew about it.
On the 31st of July 2008, less than 2 weeks after his first trip to the UK, David Heiss borrowed his uncle's car and began the long drive from Germany to Nottingham, determined to settle the score with Matthew and prove to Joanna that she should be with him.
At this point, David was totally obsessed with Joanna and was stalking her.
Without taking any breaks to rest, Heiss drove relentlessly for hour after hour.
He is intent on travelling all the way to Nottingham, that's evident. About 2:30 in the morning, Heiss's car leaves the road at high speed and goes into a ditch.
David Heiss's absolute obsession had delivered him to the brink of destruction. In the early hours of the 1st of August 2008, David Heiss had lost control of his car during a non-stop journey from Germany to Nottingham and crashed. It was a miracle he survived.
As the car that David was driving was a left-hand drive, when it left the road, had it been a right-hand drive, his injuries would have been a lot more serious, perhaps fatal.
Heiss was rescued by the British Emergency Services and was open with them about the reason for his mammoth journey.
The police officers we spoke to that attended the scene told us of a man who was there alone in his car, having come to UK to visit his girlfriend in Nottingham. They hadn't been going out very long. However, he did speak to her quite a lot over the internet.
Heiss was telling the police about Joanna, who did live in Nottingham but was not his girlfriend. He had developed an online infatuation with her that within a matter of weeks had become altogether more sinister, and even a near-death experience would not deter him.
David was obsessed with Joanna and he was stalking her. And there's no other word to describe it other than he stalked her.
Joanna was scared, but took comfort from the fact that she believed Heiss was at home in Germany. But he wasn't.
Jo arrived home from work, and as she approaches her address, she sees Heiss waiting for her.
Heiss's intense fixation with Joanna had begun to seriously trouble the couple, but they never revealed their concerns to anyone outside the forum, not even to their families.
Matthew kept most things quite close to himself. If he had a problem, he didn't like to burden other people with it. So we were always quite late in finding out if there was a problem.
Matthew and Joanna believed they could cope with the situation.
Living away from home for the first time, they thought that they were now adults and they could sort of deal with things on their own. If he'd have come to me and said, I'm having a problem, I would have been there in a heartbeat.
Matthew and Joanna desperately began to think of a way to get Heiss to leave Nottingham again, but it became increasingly clear he would not go back to Germany until he saw the object of his obsession.
She knows that Heiss is only here to see her, and he's just pursuing her. This has slowly but surely dawned on her that he's become completely obsessed by her, and that obviously scares her a lot.
David wanted Joanna, and he thought that Joanna would come round to his way of thinking eventually.
As a last resort, Joanna and Matthew agreed to meet David Heiss at the Arboretum Park in Nottingham. They were determined to end Heiss's obsession with Joanna once and for all.
The conversation in the Arboretum is really quite dramatic between the group.
Joanna couldn't have been any clearer with a message to David.
Just stay out of my life! You're just ruining it!
Joanna told Heiss there was no chance she would ever be with him. She loved Matthew and he must stop harassing them. Hearing the rejection face to face from Joanna crushed David Heiss.
Heiss is so upset, is sobbing, and can be barely understood by Joe.
The situation was clearly getting out of hand, and in a moment of calm, Joanna and David Heiss agreed, quite adultly, to have a ceasefire and not to contact each other for a set amount of time.
As Matthew and Joanna left the park that day, they believed that would be the last time they ever saw David Heiss and that their online troubles were over. Heiss returned to Germany on the 2nd of August 2008, but his fixation with Joanna continued.
David didn't want to move on. He couldn't let himself move on.
Despite the promises he'd made in the park, once back in Germany, Heiss's obsession reached a new level of intensity. On the 16th of September 2008, he and Joanna talked online.
He makes reference to suicide and doing away with his life, which is no longer worthwhile if Joanna doesn't want to be in it. And he discusses the possibility of turning up in Nottingham and committing suicide in front of Joanna.
Distraught, Joanna permanently blocked David Heiss. But although he could not contact her online, he decided to find another way to get in touch.
Can I speak to Joe, please?
He telephoned her at home.
No, you can't. Can't you just leave us alone?
A blazing row ensued, after which Matthew and Joanna were both described as being hysterical, and certainly the chat log conversations, Joanna makes reference to Heiss needing to see a psychiatrist.
Matthew and Joanna told David Heiss if he ever returned to Nottingham, they would call the police. They also checked online to find out if Heiss's stalking was breaking the law. But on the evening of the 18th of September 2008, they put their worries aside because they'd been together for exactly 3 years.
Matt and Joe went out to celebrate their anniversary, but it's fair to say that at that time they weren't feeling great because of everything that had been happening. So it was a very, very low-key evening, and they were back home in their flat by about 9:30.
The next day, Joanna got up to go to work, just like any other morning.
She went to go to work. The last thing she did was she woke Matthew up, she kissed him, she told him that she loved him, and then she left.
Bye. See you.
When Joanna went out to work that morning, she had no idea she was being watched.
Joanna and Matthew would usually exchange texts throughout the day.
Joanna had tried to contact Matthew repeatedly during that day, and as she had no replies, she started to get seriously concerned.
By the time she left work, Joanna was worried about Matthew.
She runs back home. Upon entering into the communal hallway, Jo sees what she thinks is a small smear of blood. Jo is now hyperventilating. She runs to the door of her own flat and being met by an horrendous scene.
It's absolutely the worst nightmare that you can ever imagine opening your front door onto.
The flat had been ransacked. There was property all over the floor, paperwork, clothing, footwear, and at that point, the only thought that she had was that somebody had been into her flat. There had been a burglary that had gone wrong.
Any persons walking into that crime scene would have been shocked and horrified by what they'd seen.
There was blood from the front door all the way down the passageway and all the way into the living area. It was all over the bed, it was on the walls, it was absolutely everywhere.
But the horror which confronted Joanna when she first entered their flat was nothing compared to what she discovered next.
In there, she finds Matthew on the floor.
Frantic, distraught, Joanna dialed 999. But there was nothing anyone could do. Matthew had been dead for hours. It appeared he had lost his life when a robbery had gone horribly wrong.
When police officers arrived within the scene, they very, very quickly took Joanne away to the police station. She was taken into a room and they made every effort to try and comfort her and calm her down.
While Joanna was being looked after in Nottingham, down in Suffolk, a police car arrived at the Pike family home.
We'd just gone to bed, it was about 10:15, and there was a knock at the front door. There were 2 policemen standing there. Never had any inkling that it was to do with Matthew. And when they told us, I just couldn't believe it.
When my dad first broke the news to me, I remember the exact time, it was 27 minutes past 11 at night.
They didn't have much information, just that he'd been found dead in the flat. So we had no idea what had happened, and we had to wait for about an hour before we heard from the police in Nottingham, who said that he'd been found with stab wounds, and that was all they could tell us at that time. And it was just the most awful, awful night. And, well, I would never want anybody else to go through something like that.
The Nottinghamshire forensics team began investigating Matthew and Joanna's flat. The scene immediately began to reveal what had happened to 20-year-old Matthew Pike on the 19th of September 2008.
I think we both assumed that it was a burglary gone wrong, because I couldn't see that anybody who knew Matthew would want to hurt him.
The attack on Matthew was sustained, ferocious, frenzied. No one will be able to understand what Matthew went through, but what I do know is that he fought frantically for his life.
He wasn't the sort of person to cause anybody to do that. And the questions we were being asked just seemed... I remember thinking, this is really peculiar. They're talking as though it's somebody who knew him.
At the crime scene, the forensics team had found a crucial clue which proved Matthew did indeed know his killer.
Very close to Matthew's head was an old computer monitor that had been on the floor, and there was writing on the side of the computer adjacent to Matthew's head. It was written in blood. It was a message that was written in Matthew's blood. And very quickly it became evident that Matthew had tried to send us a message about what had happened.
With one of his last actions, Matthew had tried to identify the name of his killer.
How brave he was to call over there and to write, you know, to try and give the police some kind of clue as to what was happening. I mean, I wouldn't have thought to have done that if I was in his shoes. He was just so brave, and You know, if it's possible, I'd love him even more for it.
But would the 2 letters written in blood be enough to ensure detectives caught Matthew's killer? On the 19th of September 2008, 21-year-old Joanna discovered the body of her 20-year-old boyfriend at the flat they shared in Nottingham. At first, everyone assumed he'd been killed during a burglary, but before he died, Matthew Pike left detectives a vital clue.
His last efforts were to try and write the name David on the side of his computer. He never completed that. He wrote a D, he wrote an A, and then sadly he's passed away and he's not been able to write anymore, but clearly that's what he was trying to write.
And when asked by the police if she knew anyone who might wish Matthew harm, Joanna immediately gave them a name that corresponded with Matthew's dying action.
David, maybe.
It was very evident from those early conversations, having spoken with Joanne, that the only individual that would have wanted to take Matthew's life was David Heiss.
Saying that he loved me and
Joanna revealed the months of problems they had endured as a result of David Heiss becoming relentlessly obsessed with her. But all she knew about Heiss, apart from his name and username, was that he lived somewhere in Germany. Nottinghamshire detectives had to urgently solve the mystery. They turned to Matthew and Joanna's website. They asked all the other website forum users to keep behaving online as if nothing had happened, so they didn't make Heiss nervous. Meanwhile, one of the detectives quickly became a member of the forum.
I could observe what was being said and who was online, who was talking and what they were talking about. And if there was any information that was going to be important to the inquiry, how to feed that into the inquiry as quickly as possible.
And he discovered David Heiss was online, talking about Matthew with other forum members.
David Heiss actually introduced in a conversation with another user that, "You don't think I did it, do you? I can prove that I was at home on Friday." And the other user says to him, "Prove it." And he says, "What?" and sends a copy of a travel ticket for the Friday morning to prove that he was actually in Germany.
David Heiss seemed confident he could prove his innocence. It also appeared he had been online, using the forum the day of Matthew's murder. David Heiss had alibis. But they were alibis the Nottinghamshire detectives were prepared to test. They started with the airports to see whether Heiss had entered the UK around the time of Matthew's murder.
We knew that Heiss had travelled before, and sure enough, we found him on a passenger mandate from flights in and out of Frankfurt into Birmingham. As a result of that, I was dispatched down to Birmingham Airport to try and locate Heiss on the CCTV footage from within the airport.
The CCTV footage from Birmingham Airport clearly showed David Heiss boarding a plane to Frankfurt 4 hours after Matthew's murder on the 19th of September 2008. His alibis were lies. Heiss had secretly travelled to the UK.
That was a eureka moment. It's the first time we had a physical description of what Heiss was wearing, and also it gave me an idea of who to look for on the inbound footage. We could then use that information to properly analyse the Nottingham CCTV, and hopefully we'd find him at our scene.
Detectives were able to find CCTV footage revealing Heiss's journey from the airport all the way to Matthew and Joanna's address the night before the attack. They were also able to track his return journey the morning of the brutal murder. David Heiss was at the murder scene, but he remained a complete mystery. All the detectives knew was that he lived somewhere in Germany. The race was on to arrest him. Detectives turned to the members of the website forum asking for any information about the elusive Heiss, known as Eagle the Lightning.
But it told us about the accident on the 1st of August on the M11 in Cambridge.
And we were aware that after the crash, that a person had been taken to the hospital. We managed to ascertain some details and an address in Germany for our main suspect.
Less than 5 days after the murder, Nottinghamshire police had tracked David Heiss down. On the 24th of September 2008, he was arrested at home by the German police. Detectives called the Pike family to tell them the news.
We had a phone call to say that they'd got a suspect, but that was the first time I heard his name. Didn't know anything about him up until then.
David Heiss was in custody, and the Nottinghamshire detective team travelled to Germany to question him. And when Heiss was interviewed, he confessed.
Heiss admitted that he'd been to Nottingham and they'd stabbed Matthew Pike.
But he claimed he only did so in self-defence. David Heiss was confessing to manslaughter, not premeditated murder.
He didn't actually want to admit a murder because that first account only indicated that he had gone there to hurt Matthew and to punch him, and that a fight had ensued, and that the knife he had with him he used to defend himself, and that he had stabbed Matthew in order to protect himself from what Matthew was going to do to him.
That there was no way that anybody would consider that Matthew had taken his own life.
It was very evident that Matthew Pike fought for his life, struggled incessantly inside the flat, and Heiss had a clear realisation that anybody that would have walked in there would have known that that wasn't somebody that took his own life. So he then decided to make it look like a burglary. He travelled to the UK with one thing on his mind, and that was to kill Matthew Pike.
David Heiss was extradited to the UK to await trial. While the case was being prepared for court, the Pike family had to deal with their grief at losing Matthew.
Christmas was horrible. We didn't really want to celebrate it. We didn't want to do anything, but we've got grandchildren and we've still got Adam to consider. So we did the best we could and we got through it. You know, it's one in a long line of first occasions that we had to go through, and you just do it because you have to.
On the 27th of April 2009, David Heiss stood trial for the murder of Matthew Pike.
I knew it was going to be upsetting, but I hadn't realised that I would be so upset right from the first day as I was. That was where the pathologist was talking about and what Matthew would have been doing at particular times, and it was when he said that Matthew was in the fetal position, and that upset me.
During the trial, the detective team presented their case to the jury. David Heiss had booked his plane tickets from Frankfurt to Birmingham over a week before flying and had asked his sister in Germany to log on to the website for him in his name whilst he was out of the country, to create an alibi. Heiss travelled to Nottingham on the 18th of September 2008 and waited outside Matthew and Joanna's flat overnight. He watched Joanna go to work at 7:30 a.m. on the morning of the 19th of September. Half an hour later, he went to the couple's apartment and knocked on the door. When Matthew opened the door, Heiss immediately began his attack, viciously stabbing Matthew for the first time at the doorway to his flat. He then stabbed him a further 85 times. Heiss had arrived with the fake suicide note ready in his pocket, but realised the murder was so violent, so brutal, that no one would believe Matthew had killed himself. Heiss decided instead to make it appear the flat had been burgled. As Matthew lay dying, he created a vital clue for detectives by writing the letters D and A in his own blood. Meanwhile, Heiss washed himself, changed into the spare clothes he had brought with him, and left the apartment, carrying his blooded clothes back to Germany. He had been in the UK just 16 hours. On the 11th of May 2009, the jury found David Heiss guilty of the murder of Matthew Pike at Nottingham Crown Court. He was sentenced to life imprisonment.
I was overjoyed that he was found guilty, and you know he's been put away. But no sense they would bring Matthew back.
I was relieved, but then I started to feel sorry for him because this was going to wreck his life as well. And I know that sounds ridiculous because he'd murdered my son, but I think it's part of being a mother.
The tragic 21st century crime that robbed Joanna of her loving boyfriend and Matthew's family of their beloved son, brother and uncle could clearly happen to anyone, anywhere.
People gain a great deal of confidence when they're on the computer within their own homes. They dish out information and form friendships with people that they don't actually really know. It's a very, very dangerous practice, and people should think very long and hard before they disclose their personal information on the computer.
Following the trial, Joanna has begun trying to rebuild her life.
We're still in touch with Joanna. She's actually become godmother to one of Adam's children, and she's going to go back to university soon. She's trying to rebuild her life. She'll never forget Matthew, but she's got to carry on.
Matthew Pike will never be forgotten. After his death, the website he created with Joanna was flooded with tributes to Matthew, celebrating his life and talent.
I knew nothing about the website that he was involved in until after he died, and people told me then, and I wish he had, because I was so proud and so impressed.